There is a river in Canada so wide that early European explorers mistook it for the open sea. It stretches more than 1,000 kilometers from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic, draining nearly a quarter of the world's fresh water through a single corridor of rock and forest and tidal current. At its mouth, where the river opens into the Gulf, the water is cold enough to kill a man in minutes. The fog can swallow a ship whole, and in the dark months of the year, the nights are very long indeed. Most people, even those who have lived their whole lives along its banks, think of the St. Lawrence as a peaceful thing, a working river, a river of ferry crossings and fishing boats and grain freighters moving slowly through the morning mist. The kind of river that appears on postcards and tourist maps with arrows indicating where the whales come to feed. The kind of river that feels, in some fundamental way, safe. For 3 years between 1942 and 1944, it was anything but. For 3 years, German submarines hunted in these waters. They crept through the Cabot Strait under cover of darkness, navigated by tidal charts their crews could barely read, and lay silent on the river bottom, in water, shallow enough that a man on shore could theoretically have waded out toward them. They torpedoed merchant ships within sight of village church steeples. They sank a passenger ferry carrying women and children in the middle of the night. They struck a Canadian warship so quickly that the vessel went under before many of her crew had time to understand what was happening. And for much of the time that all of this was occurring, the Canadian public was not permitted to know about it. The government had imposed a near-total blackout on news of the attacks, partly to prevent panic, partly to deny the enemy the satisfaction of knowing how effective their campaign had been. Lighthouse keepers filed reports that were classified. Survivors were asked not to speak. Fishing communities who had watched ships burn on the water at dusk went to bed that night with a secret the rest of the country would not fully learn for decades. This is the story of one of the most consequential and least known naval campaigns of the Second World War. It unfolded not in the grey wastes of the mid-Atlantic, not off the coast of some distant and exotic shore, but in the heart of Canada, in a waterway that the people of Quebec and Nova Scotia and Newfoundland had sailed since before the country existed. It involved more than 20 ships sunk, hundreds of lives lost, and a sustained campaign that at one point forced the complete closure of the river to ocean-going traffic. By any measure, it was a significant military engagement, and yet for most of the second half of the 20th century, it occupied barely a footnote in the national memory. Part of that obscurity was deliberate. The censorship that suppressed news of the sinkings during the war did not immediately lift when the war ended. The classified files stayed classified. The naval records remained restricted. The survivors, many of whom had spent years carrying the weight of what they had seen, aged quietly in communities along the river and the Gulf, while the broader public narrative of Canadian participation in the Second World War coalesced around other things: Dieppe, the Italian campaign; D-Day, the liberation of the Netherlands. The Battle of the St. Lawrence existed in a kind of official parenthesis, acknowledged in specialist histories and naval studies, but absent from the popular story Canadians told themselves about the war. Part of that obscurity, too, was perhaps a matter of national discomfort. Canada entered the Second World War as a young country still defining itself militarily. The Royal Canadian Navy expanded at a pace that was nothing short of extraordinary, from a peacetime force of barely a few thousand men to one of the largest naval establishments in the world by 1945. That expansion was a genuine achievement and a point of lasting pride. But the early years of the battle in the St. Lawrence were not a story of triumph. They were a story of unpreparedness, of institutional growing pains, of good men in inadequate ships fighting a technically superior enemy in conditions that made their job nearly impossible. The censorship that hid the sinkings from the public also, perhaps conveniently, spared the government and the Navy from the full weight of accountability at a moment when the war effort could not afford a crisis of confidence. But the river remembers. The wrecks are still down there, resting on the floor of the Gulf and the estuary, in water dark enough that even at midday the light barely reaches them. Some of them have been located and documented by divers and marine archaeologists. Others remain only as coordinates in a naval operations file, a name in a casualty list, a family's unanswered question that passed from one generation to the next without a satisfying answer. There are men at the bottom of the St. Lawrence who were not Canadian, not British, merchant sailors from a dozen countries who happened to be aboard the wrong ship at the wrong moment, whose families received the telegram and then, often, very little else. Over the course of what follows, we are going to tell this story from the beginning. We will start with the river itself, its geography, its strategic importance, the convoys that began forming on its waters in the early months of the war. We will trace the expansion of Germany's submarine campaign from the mid-Atlantic to the American eastern seaboard, and then north and west into Canadian waters, following the logic of Admiral Karl Dönitz as he pushed his boats ever further in search of undefended targets. We will sit with the Royal Canadian Navy as it struggled to build a fighting force fast enough to meet a threat it had scarcely imagined, and we will follow the first German submarines as they slipped through the Cabot Strait and into the Gulf with the quiet confidence of hunters who know the prey has not yet heard them coming. We will spend time with both sides of this battle, the exhausted Canadian escort crews running convoy after convoy through fog and freezing rain, with sonar that barely worked and aircraft that couldn't reach them in time, and the U-boat crews below the surface in their steel cylinders, navigating tidal channels by dead reckoning in a river that offered none of the deep water refuge they were trained to use. We will recount the sinkings, not as abstractions, but as events that happened to specific people on specific nights. The torpedo strike that lit up the water, the cold that killed faster than the sea, the voices that called out in the dark and were not always answered. We will follow the turning of the tide, because it did turn. The Canadians learned, they built, they improved, and the submarines that had once moved through these waters with something close to impunity began to find themselves hunted by men who had spent 2 years learning, at great cost, exactly how to find them. And we will end where the river ends, with a meditation on memory, on obscurity, on what it means for a nation to have fought a battle in its own backyard, and then, for a generation, to have looked away from it. If you are settled in, if the night is quiet around you, and you are ready to let this story unfold at its own pace, then stay with us. This is the complete history of the Battle of the St. Lawrence, one of the Second World War's most surprising chapters, and one of Canada's most closely guarded secrets. The river is waiting. There is a river in the north of the world so large that early European explorers, pressing inland from the Atlantic in their small wooden ships, believed they had found the passage to Asia. They had not. What they had found was something almost as extraordinary. A corridor of water reaching roughly 3,000 kilometers into the interior of a continent, connecting the open ocean to the heart of a landmass that would one day become one of the most consequential nations of the 20th century. The St. Lawrence is not merely a river in the way that word is commonly understood. It is a system, a vast, living architecture of water that begins at the outflow of the Great Lakes and widens, steadily and almost imperceptibly, until it becomes something closer to a sea. By the time it reaches the gulf that bears its name, it is more than 300 kilometers wide in places. Standing on its southern shore and looking north, a person cannot see the other side. That scale is important to hold in the mind before anything else can be understood about what happened here during the Second World War, because the St. Lawrence was not a remote or peripheral feature of the Canadian nation in 1942. It was the nation's spine. The cities of Montreal and Quebec City had grown precisely because of the river, because goods moved along it, because populations clustered around it, because the entire interior logic of Canadian commerce and culture had organized itself around the fact of this water highway reaching from the Atlantic to the center of the continent. Montreal, by the early years of the war, was one of the most important port cities in the entire British Empire. Ships came up the river from the Gulf, past Quebec City, with its fortress promontory, standing watch over the Narrows, and docked along the Montreal waterfront to unload cargo that had crossed the ocean and load new cargo that would cross it again. The river was the artery. Everything else was tissue built around it. When war came to Europe in the autumn of 1939, Canada entered within days. The country was not militarily powerful at that moment. Its army was a skeleton force, its navy modest, its air force still finding its feet. But its geography made it immediately and enormously valuable to the Allied cause. Canada sat between Britain and the vast industrial output of North America. The St. Lawrence sat between Canada's interior and the Atlantic. It was, almost by geometric necessity, the route along which the sinews of Allied power would have to flow. Wheat from the prairie provinces moved east by rail to Montreal and then downriver by ship. Lumber from Quebec's forests, nickel from the mines of northern Ontario, aluminum smelted in the plants along the Saguenay. All of it funneled toward the river and then out through the Gulf toward Britain, toward the armies, toward the factories, making the weapons, and the soldiers eating the food, and the ships carrying everything across an ocean that was rapidly becoming one of the most dangerous bodies of water on Earth. In the early months of the war, before the Atlantic truly turned lethal, the movement of this cargo had a kind of grim orderliness to it. Convoys were already being organized by the end of 1939, groups of merchant ships sailing in formation, escorted by warships whose job was to discourage attack and, if attack came, to respond. The convoy system had been learned the hard way in the previous war, when unrestricted German submarine warfare had very nearly strangled Britain into submission. This time, planners were not going to make the same mistake. Ships would move in groups. They would have protection. And critically, in the early strategic thinking of the naval staff in Ottawa, the St. Lawrence itself was considered a safe zone, an inland waterway so far from the open ocean, so confined, so monitored by the simple fact of settlement along its banks, that no enemy submarine would dare, or perhaps even be capable of, entering it. This assumption would prove to be one of the most expensive miscalculations of the entire North American War. To understand why the assumption seemed reasonable, it helps to stand again for a moment in the geography and the technology of 1939 and 1940. The submarine threat, in those first years, was conceived as an ocean threat. The North Atlantic was where the wolves hunted, in the deep water, in the vast and empty spaces between continents where a submarine could maneuver freely, dive deep, and vanish. The St. Lawrence was something else entirely. Its upper reaches were shallow. Its tidal patterns were complex and unpredictable. It was, in significant stretches, fresh water, or nearly so, which played strange tricks on sonar equipment and submarine buoyancy alike. Its gulf was vast, but its river approaches were narrow enough that the people on the shore could watch individual ships pass from their front windows. The very intimacy of the geography seemed to make covert submarine operation within it impossible. No German naval commander, the thinking went, would send an expensive and irreplaceable submarine into those waters. The risk would not justify the reward. What this reasoning failed to account for was the nature of the men then commanding Germany's submarine fleet, and the strategic pressures that would soon drive them to attempt things that reasonable calculations said could not be done. It also failed to account for the technology that was, even as Canadian planners made their confident assumptions, being tested and refined in the shipyards of the Third Reich. But those considerations belonged to a future the planners had not yet arrived at. In the winters of 1940 and 1941, the St. Lawrence froze in its upper reaches, as it always had. Navigation ceased, as it always did, and the river slept under ice, while the war raged in places that seemed, still, mercifully far away. But the river never truly slept. Even in winter, the preparation continued. The Royal Canadian Navy was expanding at a rate that would have seemed fantastical just a few years earlier. A service of fewer than 2,000 men in 1939, growing towards 60,000 within a few years, crewing ships that were being launched from Canadian yards at a pace the country had never before attempted. The corvette became the signature vessel of this expansion. A small, tough, highly uncomfortable warship, designed for convoy escort work in exactly the kind of rough seas the North Atlantic and the Gulf of St. Lawrence could produce. They were built quickly, and they were crewed quickly, which meant they were built and crewed by people who were learning as they went, in conditions that left very little margin for error, against an enemy that had been practicing its trade since before the war began. Quebec City watched all of this from its heights. The city sat at the point where the river narrows dramatically. The word Quebec itself derives from an indigenous word, meaning something close to where the river narrows. And this geographic feature had made it a natural fortress and a natural choke point for river traffic since the earliest days of European settlement. Ships heading upriver to Montreal had to pass beneath its cliffs. Ships heading downriver to the Gulf passed beneath them too. The city had a quality in those war years of watching, of occupying a high vantage point over events that were already in motion and whose consequences were not yet clear. The people of Quebec saw the convoys forming in the river below them. They saw the warships moving to take up escort positions. They knew, in the way that port cities always know, that something significant was being organized, and that the river they had lived beside for generations was playing a role in something much larger than itself. Montreal was less reflective about it, or perhaps more practically absorbed. The port facilities along the waterfront were working at a pace that had not been seen since the previous war, and the city around them had the electric, exhausted quality of a place that knows it is essential and is straining to meet that knowledge with action. Goods moved through Montreal in quantities that strained the rail connections, the dock facilities, the warehousing, the labor force. The river absorbed it all. The ships came and went with a regularity that was, in itself, a kind of statement about Allied intention and capacity. As long as the river moved, the logic went. The war effort moved. Canada's contribution to the survival of Britain was being measured, in significant part, in tons of cargo passing through this waterway and emerging from the Gulf into the open Atlantic beyond. It is worth pausing over the Gulf itself, because it does not always receive the attention the river does, and because it would become, in the campaigns to come, the primary theatre of action. The Gulf of St. Lawrence is enormous, roughly 250 kilometers from north to south in places, and opening to the Atlantic through two primary passages. The Cabot Strait, between Newfoundland and Cape Breton Island, is the wider and more southerly of these approaches. And in the strategic thinking of 1941 and early 1942, it was considered the relevant defensive threshold. If enemy submarines were to come, they would have to come through here, through this gap in the maritime geography. And it was here that the thin line of Canadian naval defense was nominally drawn. What the Gulf looked like from the air in those years, on the rare occasions when patrol aircraft were available to fly it, was an expanse of grey-green water, dotted with the dark shapes of islands, the occasional smear of a ship's wake, and the endless, indifferent horizon. The men who would fight and die in the Battle of the St. Lawrence had not yet met the event that would define them. The U-boat commanders, who would bring their vessels into these waters, were still, in the early months of 1942, engaged elsewhere, off the American coast, in the Caribbean, in the shipping lanes of the mid-Atlantic. The convoys were still forming, still sailing, still arriving and departing from the ports along the river, with the regularity of commerce, dressed in the clothing of war. And the river itself moved as it had always moved, indifferent, ancient, carrying the water of a continent toward the sea, not knowing and not caring that it was about to become a battlefield. That knowledge belonged only to the men on both sides who were, in their separate ways, looking at maps and calculating what was possible. What was possible, it would turn out, was far more terrible than almost anyone in Canada had yet allowed themselves to imagine. For most of the first 2 years of the Second World War, the Atlantic Ocean had a geography that made a kind of terrible sense. The killing happened out there, in the deep water, in the mid-ocean gap where Allied air cover could not reach, in the long grey corridors between Britain and the ports of North America. The U-boats hunted where the ocean was widest and the convoys slowest, and the people who lived along the coasts of Canada and the United States understood the war the way they understood a distant storm, visible on the horizon, felt in the casualty lists, but not yet present in the sound of breaking wood and rising water. That understanding was about to be destroyed, not by any failure of courage or intelligence, but by the cold logic of an admiral sitting in a headquarters in France, moving markers across a chart, following the prey wherever it chose to run. Admiral Karl Dönitz had spent the first years of the Atlantic campaign fighting with one hand tied behind his back. He believed, with an almost mathematical conviction, that the submarine was a war-winning weapon, that if enough tonnage could be sent to the bottom fast enough, Britain would be strangled before American industrial power could tip the balance. The problem was numbers. He had never had enough boats in the right places at the right time. The wolf pack tactics that would later define the middle years of the Atlantic battle were the product of necessity as much as genius, ways of concentrating limited forces against the convoy routes that mattered most. But by the final weeks of 1941, Dönitz was watching something change. The United States was arming Britain, feeding Britain, effectively fighting a shadow war on Britain's behalf, and then, in December of that year, the shadow became substance. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and Germany, bound by the terms of the Tripartite Pact, declared war on the United States of America. For Dönitz, this was not only a political event, it was an operational one. The American eastern seaboard in the first days of January 1942 was a submariner's paradise. The United States Navy, despite having watched the Battle of the Atlantic unfold for more than 2 years, had made almost no preparations for coastal convoy escort. Ships moved independently, lit up the night sky with their silhouettes against the glow of coastal cities that had not yet dimmed their lights, and sailed along predictable routes at predictable speeds. There were almost no dedicated escort vessels. There was almost no coordinated air patrol. The sea lanes between Halifax and the Florida Keys were, by the standards of what the Royal Navy had learned through years of bitter experience, completely naked. Dönitz grasped this immediately. He called his plan Paukenschlag, a drumbeat, a sounding of the great drum, a declaration that the war had arrived. The submarines Dönitz sent for the first blow were not the workhorses of the mid-Atlantic, the Type 7 boats, compact and numerous, whose range made them ideal for the convoy corridors further east. Paukenschlag required boats that could cross the entire width of the Atlantic, linger for weeks in distant waters, and still carry enough torpedoes to make the crossing worthwhile. The weapon for that job was the Type 9, a larger, longer-ranged boat, displacing more than 1,000 tons when surfaced, capable of remaining at sea for months at a stretch, and ranging as far as the South Atlantic, or, crucially, the waters of North America's eastern coast. The Type 9 carried enough fuel to go where the 7th could not reach, and enough torpedoes to make the journey profitable. It was not the most maneuverable submarine in the German fleet, and in the tight, dangerous waters it would later be sent into, its size would become a liability. But in the winter of 1942, running free along an undefended coastline, it was a predator without equal. What followed was, by any honest accounting, a catastrophe for the Allies. Through January, February, and March of 1942, U-boats operating along the American eastern seaboard and in the Gulf of Mexico sank ships at a rate that stunned even Dönitz. Tankers went down within sight of the New Jersey coast. Freighters burned off the beaches of North Carolina. The sea floor from Maine to Florida received a staggering accumulation of iron and oil, and the bodies of merchant sailors from Britain, Norway, Greece, the Netherlands, and dozens of other nations. The Americans called it the Second Happy Time, a name that carries within it the measure of how one-sided the slaughter was, borrowed from the U-boat crew's own term for the original hunting grounds of the early Atlantic War. Dönitz's boats were operating with near-total impunity in waters that were, by geography, about as far from the theoretical front lines of the war as it was possible to imagine. The pressure this placed on the broader Allied shipping network was immense and immediate. Every ship sunk off Cape Hatteras was a ship that would not deliver its cargo to Britain. Every tanker that went down in the Florida Straits represented oil that would not reach the refineries, the airfields, the vehicle depots that kept the Allied war effort turning. The mathematics of the situation were stark. The Allies needed to get more cargo across more ocean than the U-boats could sink. In the early months of 1942, they were failing that test badly, and the failure in American waters had a direct consequence for Canada, because the convoys that had been sailing south along the American coast now had to find another way to move. The carnage off the eastern seaboard was pushing traffic northward, crowding it toward the approaches to the St. Lawrence, toward the Gulf, toward waters that the Royal Canadian Navy was theoretically responsible for defending. The Royal Canadian Navy was not ready for what this meant, but Dönitz understood it very well. His strategic thinking at this point in the war was guided by a principle his staff had almost reduced to formula: go where the shipping is, go where the defenses are weakest, and keep moving before the enemy can adapt. The American seaboard was already beginning to harden, slowly and painfully, as the United States Navy absorbed its lessons and began organizing convoy escorts and coastal air patrols. The window of near-total impunity was closing, but the logic of the campaign did not end with the closing of one window. It demanded the opening of another. Dönitz began looking north and west, at the charts of Canadian waters, at the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and at the long, deep river that fed the industrial heartland of a nation at war. The Gulf of St. Lawrence presented a set of contradictions that made it both tempting and terrifying as a potential operating area. On one hand, it was among the most heavily trafficked bodies of water in the Western Hemisphere during wartime. The funnel through which Canadian grain, steel, timber, and manpower passed on its way to Britain. Ships that had crossed from Halifax or Sydney entered the Gulf through the Cabot Strait, the wide gap between the northern tip of Cape Breton Island and the southwestern coast of Newfoundland, and once inside, they were committed to a relatively enclosed sea with limited exits and geography that channeled them along predictable routes. For a submarine commander with the right boat and the right nerve, this was a hunting ground of extraordinary potential. On the other hand, the Gulf was shallow by the standards of the open Atlantic, with tidal currents and temperature gradients that played havoc with acoustic detection for attacker and defender alike, and with a freshwater influence from the river itself that affected a submarine's buoyancy in ways that required constant adjustment and constant attention. The Type 9 could make the passage. That was the fundamental operational fact. With sufficient fuel and careful navigation through the Cabot Strait, a boat of that class could enter the Gulf, conduct a patrol, and return to its French base without exhausting its range. The question was whether the prize justified the challenge, and through the spring of 1942, Dönitz concluded that it did. The convoys were there, the escorts were thin, the air cover was minimal. The underwater environment, while demanding, was manageable for experienced crews. And above all, the psychological and strategic impact of striking inside Canadian waters, inside the river itself, would be enormous. It would demonstrate that no corner of the Allied world was safe. It would stretch the already overstretched Canadian defences across an even wider front. It would force escorts away from the mid-Atlantic convoy routes where they were desperately needed. From Dönitz's perspective, it was, in every sense, worth attempting. What the German admiral could not fully appreciate from his headquarters in Lorient was the human texture of the place he was sending his boats. The St. Lawrence was not just a strategic waterway. It was a river that people lived beside, that fishing villages had grown up along, that ferry routes crossed, that lighthouse keepers tended in all seasons. It was a river that Canadians had never imagined as a battlefield, because it was so completely, so essentially theirs. The farmers and fishermen and dock workers who lived along its banks knew it the way people know the geography of their own lives, intimately, practically, without drama. The idea that German submarines might enter this water, that the war that was burning across Europe and the Pacific and the mid-Atlantic might come up the river to their doorsteps, was not something that the lived logic of their world had prepared them for. Dönitz's mathematics made no allowance for that. It didn't need to. The submarines were already moving. The winter of 1941 into 1942 was the turning point. Not the moment the tide shifted in the Allies' favor, but the moment the geometry of the entire Atlantic War changed shape. The Americans were in. The seaboard was burning. The convoys were rerouting. And a fleet of long-range submarines, built precisely for this kind of deep-range, high-reward operation, was being aimed at waters that a country of 11 million people had barely begun to think of as a front line. The drum was sounding, and along the banks of the greatest river in North America, no one yet knew to listen for it. By the spring of 1942, Canada was at war in a way its institutions had never been designed to handle. The Royal Canadian Navy, that existed on the 3rd of September 1939, the day Britain declared war on Germany and Canada prepared to follow, was, by any honest measure, a coastal patrol force wearing the uniform of a blue water navy. It had fewer than 4,000 officers and men. It had 6 destroyers, 5 minesweepers, and a collection of smaller vessels that would have looked modest in peacetime, let alone in the opening rounds of the most destructive maritime conflict in human history. What Canada had instead of ships was something harder to quantify, and ultimately more important: a willingness to build, to recruit, to improvise, and to sacrifice. And over the 2.5 years between that declaration and the spring when the submarines came, that willingness had produced something extraordinary. The Royal Canadian Navy had expanded at a pace that had no real parallel in the history of the country. But expansion at speed is not the same as readiness. And in the spring of 1942, the gulf between those two things was wide enough to sink a ship. The numbers told a story that looked impressive until you read the footnotes. By 1942, the Royal Canadian Navy had grown to tens of thousands of men, a multiplication of its pre-war strength that would have seemed impossible to the officers who had spent the 1930s nursing a service that its own government barely wanted to fund. New ships were coming out of Canadian yards in a rhythm that genuinely astonished observers on both sides of the Atlantic. The corvette program in particular had transformed the industrial capacity of ports and shipyards that had previously built river ferries and fishing trawlers. But the men who crewed these vessels were not, in any traditional sense, sailors. They were farmers from Saskatchewan, clerks from Toronto, fishermen from Nova Scotia, who knew small boats in coastal waters, but had never read an Aztec trace or calculated an attack geometry against a submerged contact. They were brave, most of them. They were willing. But willingness is not doctrine, and courage does not substitute for the kind of deep institutional knowledge that takes years to accumulate and cannot be shortcut by any amount of wartime urgency. The corvette itself was, in one sense, the embodiment of that contradiction. Designed in Britain as a simple, mass-producible escort vessel that could be built quickly and crewed by men with limited sea experience, the Flower-class corvette was a genuine achievement of wartime engineering pragmatism, roughly 60 meters in length, displacing somewhere in the region of 900 tons, rolling with a motion that became legendary among the men who served in her. The corvette was intended for coastal patrol, but found herself pressed into transatlantic convoy duty almost immediately. She was armed with depth charges, a forward gun, and an Aztec sonar set that was only as useful as the operator behind it. She could make perhaps 16 knots on a good day in calm water. She had a range sufficient for the Atlantic crossing, but no margin for comfort, no margin for error. And in the peculiar water conditions of the St. Lawrence, cold, layered, freshwater influenced in the upper reaches, tidal and treacherous throughout, her sonar performance was compromised in ways her designers had never anticipated and her operators barely understood. The corvette was the backbone of Canada's convoy escort. She was also, in the spring of 1942, very often crewed by men, learning their trade as they performed it, under conditions that forgave nothing. The Royal Canadian Air Force presented a picture that was different in character, but not in essential quality. Here too, there had been expansion of remarkable scale. Canada had become the home of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, an undertaking so vast that it had turned the prairies into an assembly line for aircrew from across the Commonwealth. Pilots, navigators, wireless operators, bomb aimers, flowing through training schools in numbers that would eventually prove decisive. But the aircraft and crews devoted to maritime patrol, the painstaking, unglamorous, technically demanding work of hunting submarines from the air over cold grey water, represented a much smaller share of that effort than the strategic reality of the Atlantic War required. The Gulf of St. Lawrence and the river approaches were patrolled by aircraft that were frequently too short-ranged, too lightly equipped, and too few. The anti-submarine version of this work demanded radar sets capable of detecting a submarine's conning tower at low altitude in poor visibility, and in the spring of 1942, those sets were in short supply, and the operators who could use them effectively were shorter still. The air cover that existed over the Gulf was thin, irregular, and in the most tactically critical hours, the hours before dawn, the hours of overcast and fog that the St. Lawrence produced with such regularity, often absent entirely. Within Ottawa, the debate about the true nature of the threat was slower to resolve than the facts on the water warranted. The Naval Service headquarters was not staffed by foolish men. They understood, in the abstract, that the expansion of German submarine operations under Admiral Karl Dönitz followed a logic of opportunism, that wherever Allied defenses were weakest, submarines would probe, and that the successes of Operation Drumbeat along the American eastern seaboard in the opening months of 1942 had demonstrated just how catastrophic the consequences of unpreparedness could be. What was harder to accept at the institutional level was the specific proposition that U-boats would enter the St. Lawrence. The Gulf was one thing, it was still, just barely, open ocean in the minds of planners accustomed to thinking in blue water terms. But the river itself, with its confined channels, its tidal complexity, its proximity to populated shores, its shallow and variable depths, the idea that a German submarine commander would choose to navigate those waters seemed, to some, to strain credibility. That reluctance to believe was not stupidity. It was the very human tendency to assume that an enemy will be deterred by the things that would deter you. The Fairmile motor launches that supplemented the corvettes along the river represented the other end of the defensive spectrum, small, fast, and suited for inshore patrol in a way the deeper drafted corvettes were not. Built of wood, powered by petrol engines, and crewed by officers and men who were often younger than their vessels felt, the Fairmiles operated in the shallower reaches where larger warships could not safely go. They carried depth charges and hydrophone listening equipment and the willingness of their crews, which was considerable. But they were not submarine hunters in any sophisticated sense. They were presence, more than capability, a signal that something was being done, rather than a guarantee that it would succeed. In the geography of the St. Lawrence, where the river stretched for hundreds of kilometers through some of the most demanding waters in the Northern Hemisphere, a handful of Fairmile launches amounted to very little coverage and only slightly more deterrence. What Canada lacked above all, in the spring of 1942, was not ships or aircraft, or men in the raw sense. It lacked time. Time to train the operators who could read an ASDIC trace correctly in complex water conditions. Time to develop the doctrine for coordinated air and sea attacks on a surfaced or submerged contact. Time to build the communications networks that would allow an aircraft sighting to be passed smoothly to an escort group that could act on it before the contact was lost. These were not failures of courage or commitment. They were failures of the clock, the inevitable consequence of a service that had expanded so far, so fast, that the institutional knowledge required to make it effective simply could not keep pace with the hulls and the headcount. The men of the Royal Canadian Navy and Royal Canadian Air Force were not inadequate. They were early. They were operating at the leading edge of a learning curve that would, in time, transform them into something formidable. But in the spring of 1942, that transformation had not yet happened, and the submarines were already on their way. There is something almost unbearable, in retrospect, about the particular quality of that spring. The convoys were forming and sailing. The escorts were taking their stations. The patrol aircraft were flying their assigned routes over grey water that gave nothing away. The men who manned the lighthouses on the Gaspé coast and the headlands of Cape Breton were watching the water as they always had, and the water looked the same as it always had. The communities along the river, the small towns and fishing villages and farming settlements that had spent centuries beside this immense waterway, had no reason to imagine that the war was approaching them at periscope depth, reading their coastline, measuring the distances. Ottawa had its debates and its estimates and its reluctant acknowledgements that the threat might be more proximate than comfortable. The Navy had its corvettes and its fair miles and its eager, undertrained crews. The Air Force had its patrols and its shortages and its faith in equipment that had not yet been fully tested. And somewhere in the North Atlantic, the decisions had already been made. The orders had already been cut, and the long hulls of the Type 9 boats were already turning toward the west and north, toward the cold water and the narrow straits, toward a river that had never been a battlefield and was about to become one. Canada was not ready. The question of whether it could become ready fast enough was about to be answered in the most unforgiving way possible. For months, the St. Lawrence had felt like a sanctuary. While the American eastern seaboard burned, tankers erupting in columns of fire visible from hotel balconies in Florida, from boardwalks in New Jersey, the Gulf of St. Lawrence remained quiet, cold, and seemingly inviolable. Naval planners in Ottawa and Halifax had leaned on this assumption with growing confidence through the early months of 1942. The Gulf was too far from Germany. The approaches were too narrow, too treacherous, too unfamiliar to any crew that had not spent years learning their currents and their fogs. The Cabot Strait, that roughly 100-kilometer gap between Cape Breton Island and the southwestern tip of Newfoundland, had felt less like a door and more like a wall. In the spring of that year, someone opened it. The first ships to die in the Gulf of St. Lawrence were not warships. They were merchant vessels, cargo carriers, ore freighters, tankers, the working animals of the Allied war economy, ploughing their unremarkable routes through waters their crews had been told, and genuinely believed, were safe. Some of those men had been deliberately rerouted into the Gulf, precisely because the carnage along the American coast had grown so appalling that any alternative seemed preferable. They had, in effect, been moved away from one killing ground and placed in another that had not yet been identified as such. There was no malice in this decision, only the grinding arithmetic of convoy management in a war that was, in the spring of 1942, going very badly for the Allied side. The rerouting made strategic sense on paper. On the water, it meant ships and men moved into a trap whose jaws had not yet closed. When the first attack came, the naval officers who received the report read it more than once. A ship going down inside the Gulf, not in the open Atlantic, not off the Grand Banks, but inside the enclosed body of water that Canadians had always thought of as their own, did not fit the mental architecture of the war as they had constructed it. Initial reports were questioned, then reluctantly verified. The vessel had not struck a mine. There had been no collision, no fire from internal accident. A submarine had done this, and the submarine was operating where no submarine was supposed to be. The disbelief was genuine, and it lasted longer than it should have. In those lost hours, as commanders argued with themselves about what they were reading, other ships were at sea, in the same waters, under the same sky, with the same false confidence. The U-boat that entered the Gulf in the spring of 1942 came through the Cabot Strait in darkness and submerged running, threading through one of the North Atlantic's more demanding passages. Irregular currents, variable visibility, the constant risk of detection from the air or from the shore stations that watched the approaches. The crew would have known what they were attempting. No German submarine had operated in these waters before. There were no established patrol routes to follow, no accumulated tactical wisdom passed down from previous patrols. They were navigating by chart and nerve, feeling their way into an enclosed sea whose conditions, the cold freshwater influx from the St. Lawrence River itself, the unpredictable thermal layers, the shallow shelving coastlines, were unlike anything in their operational experience. And yet they came, because their orders said to come, and because the shipping was there. The first sinkings produced survivors, and survivors told stories. Men pulled from lifeboats or plucked from the water by fishing vessels and coastal rescue craft described experiences that people on shore found genuinely difficult to absorb. They had been sailing in Canadian waters. They had been able to see land. Some of them described, in the fractured, exhausted language of men who have just watched their ship go under, the lights of settlements visible on the coast as they went into the water. These were not men lost in the vast mid-Atlantic, 1,000 kilometers from anything human. These were men who drowned within sight of a shoreline that was going about its ordinary life, largely unaware. The emotional distance between those two realities, war and daily life, death and normalcy, separated by a few kilometers of cold spring water, was one of the defining features of the Battle of the St. Lawrence, and it announced itself from the very first sinking. The communities that received these survivors were fishing villages, small port towns, lighthouse outposts, places that had sent their young men away to the war and had expected the war to follow them overseas and stay there. Instead, it arrived on their shores in the form of merchant sailors wrapped in borrowed clothing, sometimes burned, sometimes in shock, often from countries these communities had only the vaguest geographic sense of: Greek merchant sailors, Panamanian crews, men from a dozen allied nations who had been sailing for Canada's war and had ended up on Canada's doorstep in the worst possible way. The communities responded with the instinctive generosity of people who understand what the sea can do to men, whatever flag those men sail under. But they were frightened too, because if ships were sinking within sight of their headlands, then this war was not somewhere else anymore. The immediate naval response was improvised and inadequate, through no particular failure of individual commanders, but because the resources available simply did not match the scale of what was now required. The corvettes and Fairmile motor launches that constituted the escort forces in the Gulf were few in number and spread across a body of water that is, even in its narrowest reaches, several tens of kilometers wide and hundreds of kilometers long. To patrol it comprehensively with the vessels available was a geometrical impossibility, like trying to watch a house fire with a garden hose. Orders went out to tighten convoy routing, to move ships closer to shore, to reduce sailing at night. Measures that reflected reasonable tactical instincts, but that could not change the fundamental arithmetic of too few escorts covering too much water against an enemy whose exact position was unknown. The submarines were somewhere in the Gulf. Finding them was another matter entirely. The particular challenge of the St. Lawrence environment began to reveal itself in those first frantic weeks. ASDIC, the acoustic detection equipment fitted to Canadian escorts, operated on principles established in the relatively simple deep water of the North Atlantic, where temperature layers and salinity gradients behaved in predictable ways. The Gulf of St. Lawrence was not the North Atlantic. The outflow of the great river created complex layers of fresh and salt water, warm and cold, that bent and scattered acoustic pulses in ways that made ASDIC readings erratic and unreliable. A submarine that might have been clearly detectable in the open ocean could all but disappear in these conditions, lying silent in a thermal layer while a corvette hunted overhead and heard nothing convincing. The escorts were not incompetent. They were working with instruments designed for a different ocean, in a sea that did not cooperate. Aircraft should have been the answer, or part of it. A submarine caught on the surface in the Gulf by a patrol aircraft is a submarine in mortal danger, and the Gulf's enclosed geography meant that, in theory, Airborne coverage could be concentrated more efficiently than in the open Atlantic. In theory. In practice, the Royal Canadian Air Force's Eastern Air Command was stretched across an enormous area of operation, chronically short of modern maritime patrol aircraft, and hampered by weather that could close down flying operations for days at a stretch. The aircraft that did reach the Gulf in those early weeks were flying long patrols with limited endurance, carrying observers who were doing their best with limited training in the specific discipline of anti-submarine reconnaissance. They found nothing more often than not because nothing was there, but because finding a submarine from the air in the spring of 1942 was a skill that Canadian aircrew had not yet had time to develop. As the sinkings continued, a ship here, another there, the losses accumulating with a slow and sickening regularity, the mood in naval headquarters shifted from disbelief to something harder and grimmer. There was anger, the specific anger of institutions caught wrong-footed, of men who had made assumptions that seemed reasonable and were now reading casualty reports. There were demands for answers, for action, for something to show the country and the War Cabinet that the Navy was responding. But there was also, beneath the official urgency, a creeping recognition that the Gulf of St. Lawrence had become something nobody had planned for, and nobody was immediately equipped to manage. The U-boats had not simply found a new operational area. They had found a weakness, geographic, institutional, psychological, that went right to the heart of Canada's confidence in its ability to protect its own waters. For the men at sea, none of the strategic calculations meant very much. A merchant sailor going down with a torpedoed ship in the Gulf of St. Lawrence was just as dead as one lost in the mid-Atlantic. The cold water was the same cold water. The darkness was the same darkness. The question of whether his death was surprising to naval planners in Halifax was not one he could entertain. What the survivors carried ashore, past the lighthouse stations, and into the hands of communities who wrapped them in blankets and asked careful, frightened questions, was the simple physical fact of what had happened, that the war had arrived in Canadian waters and was killing people there, and that neither the Navy nor the government had been ready for it. That fact, still officially suppressed, still wrapped in the early layers of wartime censorship, lived in the bodies of survivors and in the memories of the people who received them, long before it would ever appear in a newspaper. The spring of 1942 was not the worst the Battle of the St. Lawrence would get. The worst was still coming. More ships, more losses, attacks further and further inland, all the way into the river itself. But the first strikes in the Gulf established something that would define the entire campaign: the persistent, painful gap between what the institutions responsible for protecting these waters believed was possible and what was actually happening on the water. That gap would not be closed easily, or quickly, or without cost. The submarines were inside. The question that now consumed the Royal Canadian Navy and every convoy commodore threading his ships through the Gulf was simple enough to state and agonizing to answer. How do you find them? There is a point on the St. Lawrence where the river stops feeling like a river. West of the Gaspé Peninsula, where the salt of the open Gulf gradually surrenders to something fresher and darker, the waterway narrows, the banks draw closer, and the sense of being enclosed, of being watched from the shore, becomes impossible to ignore. Church steeples appear on the northern bank. Farmhouses sit close enough to the water that the people inside them can read the names painted on a vessel's hull. This was not the open Atlantic, where a submarine could dive to 200 meters and vanish into blankness. This was a corridor, and in the summer of 1942, German U-boats chose to enter it. The decision to push submarines past the Gaspé Peninsula and into the river proper was not made lightly. Dönitz and his operational planners understood that they were proposing something qualitatively different from anything the U-boat arm had attempted before. The Gulf of St. Lawrence, confined as it was, still offered the fundamental geography of sea warfare: enough depth, enough room to maneuver, enough darkness in which to disappear. The river itself offered none of those things. Charts of the area showed water depths that would have been considered dangerously shallow, even for coastal patrols. The tidal patterns were complex, driven not just by the pull of the moon, but by the enormous freshwater discharge of the Great Lakes system, hundreds of kilometers upstream. A submarine commander, accustomed to the deep Atlantic, would have looked at those charts and seen a trap. But the same charts also showed something else: a dense, continuous stream of Allied merchant shipping, moving through a waterway that Canadian defenses had not yet fortified to anything approaching adequacy. The mathematics of risk and reward, for Dönitz, still resolved in favor of going deeper. What those charts could not fully prepare the crews for was the physical strangeness of the water itself. The St. Lawrence, at this latitude, is a meeting place of two hydrological worlds: cold, dense, salt-laden water pushing in from the Gulf along the bottom, and lighter, fresher meltwater riding above it from the continental interior. For a submarine relying on acoustic equipment and sonar, this layered structure was maddening. Sound traveled through it unpredictably, bending and scattering in ways that bore no resemblance to the open ocean. Thermoclines that would have been stable and navigable in the Atlantic shifted here with the tides, with the season, with the direction of the wind. A U-boat commander, trying to interpret his crew's sonar returns, was working with instruments calibrated for a world that simply did not exist in this river. The same layering that made detection unreliable for the Canadians worked against the submarines themselves, distorting the acoustic picture on which they depended for situational awareness. Both sides were, in different ways, hunting blind. The navigational hazards compounded these difficulties. The St. Lawrence is vast by the measure of European rivers, but treacherous by the measure of any ocean. Shoals shift. Tidal currents can run at several knots through narrows and reach unexpected strength in deeper channels. For a surfaced submarine running at night, as U-boats preferred whenever possible, the darkness that concealed the vessel from shore observers also concealed the shore itself. The charts available to German crews had been drawn primarily for merchant navigation in peacetime, not for a submarine trying to make a covert passage at low water in poor visibility. Commanders who needed to dive quickly in response to a contact or an aircraft sighting faced the terrifying possibility that the water beneath them was not deep enough to receive them. To rest on the bottom in these waters, a standard technique for avoiding depth charges in the Atlantic, meant risking an uncontrolled grounding on a riverbed of silt and rock that no German sailor had ever seen. And yet they came. In the weeks that followed the initial penetration past the Gaspé, a small number of U-boats managed to operate in the river itself, pressing upstream to areas that placed them within a few kilometers of inhabited Canadian soil. The sinkings that resulted were unlike anything else in the Atlantic campaign for the simple reason of their proximity to civilian life. Merchant ships went down within sight of the southern shore. The columns of smoke from burning vessels rose against backgrounds of forested hillside and farmland. People standing at their windows or walking along the riverbank in the early morning did not need a newspaper to tell them that something terrible was happening. They could see it. They could smell it. In some cases, they could hear it. The low, concussive thump of an explosion carrying across the water in the still air of a summer night. The communities along this stretch of the river occupied a position without precedent in Canadian civilian experience. Canada had sent men to war, to South Africa, to Flanders, to the beaches of Dieppe only weeks before these events. But Canada's own soil had not seen combat since the 19th century. Now farmers on the south shore of the St. Lawrence woke before dawn to see ships burning. Fishermen putting out in the early morning found wreckage in their usual grounds. Women in shoreline villages watched lifeboats being pulled ashore, carrying men in shock, their clothes soaked, their faces carrying the particular blankness of people who have just watched their world disappear beneath them. The cognitive distance between the abstract idea of a world war and the concrete reality of a burning tanker 3 kilometers from your front porch had, for these people, simply ceased to exist. The psychological impact on these communities was layered and difficult to process cleanly. There was fear, the obvious, immediate kind, that comes from realizing that an enemy capable of sinking a ship is operating within easy reach of your home. There was also a stranger feeling, harder to name, that some survivors and residents described in the terms available to them at the time, a sense of unreality, of the world having broken its own rules. The St. Lawrence was home. It was the river that the children played beside in summer and that froze over for skating in winter. It was the channel through which the grain of the prairies moved to feed Britain, the route along which the mail boat came and went, the backdrop of an entire regional civilization. The idea that it had become a hunting ground for German submarines scrambled something deep in the sense of order that people carry with them and rarely examine until it is disturbed. For the U-boat crews, the river presented its own psychological challenges alongside the tactical ones. The claustrophobia endemic to submarine service was intensified by the narrowing geography. In the Atlantic, even when submerged, a commander could maintain some abstract sense of the ocean's vastness around him, the knowledge that open water lay in every direction. In the St. Lawrence, that mental comfort was gone. The crew knew that the nearest land was minutes away at any speed. They knew that their ability to maneuver was constrained in ways it had never been before. A crew that ran into difficulty, mechanical failure, a damaged hull, a depth charge attack that left them disoriented, could not simply surface in deep water and take their chances. The river's margins were too close and too inhabited. The pressure this placed on commanding officers, who bore sole responsibility for their boat and their men, was considerable, even by the high standards of stress that the U-boat service routinely imposed. The sinkings themselves were carried out with the same clinical efficiency that characterized U-boat attacks elsewhere. A torpedo fired from a submerged position, detonation, the rapid listing and sinking of a vessel caught without adequate warning or escort protection. But the aftermath here was different in character from anything that played out in mid-Atlantic. Survivors from ships sunk in the open ocean faced hours or days in lifeboats, at the mercy of weather and currents, with rescue uncertain. Survivors in the St. Lawrence often reached shore within hours. Some were pulled from the water by fishing boats. Some reached the bank by their own effort. A number were helped by local residents who saw what had happened and came down to the water's edge. This proximity to help saved lives that would certainly have been lost in the open Atlantic. It also meant that the evidence of what was happening was immediate and unignorable, washing up on beaches and riverbanks in the form of wreckage, fuel oil, and living men with stories to tell. The Canadian naval and air patrols operating in the river during these weeks were well aware that their performance was inadequate to the threat, and the knowledge sat badly with commanders who understood the tactical situation clearly. The river's conditions degraded the ASDIC sonar on which the escort vessels depended. The aircraft available for patrol, flying from hastily established forward bases near the Gaspé, were too few and too limited in endurance to maintain anything approaching continuous coverage. When a contact was made, the shallow water made depth charge attacks problematic. Charges set for the depths appropriate to river conditions had narrow margins for error, and a submarine lying still on a soft bottom, flooding the boat slightly to reduce its acoustic signature, could sometimes simply wait out the attack in a stillness that looked, on the escort's instruments, indistinguishable from the riverbed around it. There were engagements during these weeks. There were attacks made, but there were no kills, and the submarines withdrew at their own choosing. What the summer of 1942 established, in the St. Lawrence River, was something that went beyond the tactical record of ships sunk and patrols flown. It established that the geographic remoteness that Canadians had always assumed as a natural buffer against the violence of the wider world was not remoteness at all. The war had always been abstract for those who did not fight in it, a thing happening somewhere else, to people elsewhere, narrated in newspapers and radio bulletins. The river had now broken that abstraction. The St. Lawrence had carried Canadian commerce to Britain for 2 years of war. It would now carry, in the memories of everyone who lived along its banks in the summer of 1942, the specific and indelible knowledge of what it meant for the war to come home. That knowledge would shape the communities along the river for a generation. It would shape Canadian naval policy for the remainder of the conflict. And it would sit, largely unspoken, beneath the official silence that the government was already moving to impose. A silence that could suppress the headlines, but could do nothing at all about the oil stains left on the rocks at the waterline, or the smell of smoke that lingered in the still summer air long after the fires had gone out. There is a particular quality to the St. Lawrence in late summer. The light falls long and amber across the water in the evenings, and from the shore, the river looks almost impossibly peaceful, wide and slow and ancient, smelling of pine and cold stone and the distant open sea. The fishing villages along its banks had known that peace for generations. They had not known war, not in this way, not this close. By the summer of 1942, that was already changing. Ships had been burning in the Gulf. Survivors had been washing onto beaches that had never before received the desperate and the drowning. But the river itself, the deep interior channel, the passage that ran past Quebec and along the Gaspé, still felt, to many Canadians, like a place apart. What happened on the 11th of September 1942 ended that feeling forever. HMCS Charlottetown was a Flower-class corvette, one of the sturdy, rounded little warships that the Royal Canadian Navy had built in such desperate haste as the war expanded and the convoys multiplied. She was not a glamorous vessel by any measure. Corvettes were known for their violent rolling in open seas, for their cramped conditions, for the relentless noise and spray that characterized life aboard them. But they were the backbone of Canada's escort service, and they were crewed by men who were proud of them, proud of the work, if not always the comfort. Charlottetown had been commissioned just over a year earlier, and in that year she had taken her place in the grinding, unglamorous business of shepherding convoys through dangerous waters. By the time she entered the St. Lawrence on her final patrol, she was a known ship, a recognized name, and her crew was a community. Young men from across Canada who had learned their trade together in conditions that bound people fast. She was operating in the St. Lawrence River that September morning, not in the open Gulf, but in the river proper, those narrowing waters where the presence of a hostile submarine still seemed, to some, almost surreal. She had a companion, the Bangor-class minesweeper, HMCS Clayoquot. The two vessels were moving in company, conducting a patrol in waters that had seen increasing alarm over the preceding weeks, though the full picture of U-boat penetration into the river was still not entirely clear to those responsible for defending it. The morning was ordinary, in the way that mornings before catastrophe always appear to be. Afterward, in retrospect, the crew went about their routines. The watch was kept. The river moved around them, as it always had, deep and cold beneath the surface warmth of a September day. The torpedo struck without warning, significant enough to save her. A U-boat, operating in waters where it had no right to be, by the logic of anyone who had not yet fully reckoned with German audacity in this campaign, had been tracking the pair of vessels and chose its moment. The explosion tore through Charlottetown with the brutal efficiency that had by now become the signature of the undersea war. Aboard the corvette, men who had been eating breakfast, checking instruments, or simply watching the river were suddenly thrown into chaos, the kind of chaos that leaves no time for the mind to catch up with the body. A ship, once struck in a vital place, does not give those aboard her the luxury of deliberation. Charlottetown began to sink almost immediately, the speed of her descent one of the cruelest aspects of what followed. A second explosion came. The exact cause of that second blast has been the subject of historical consideration. Whether it was a second torpedo or the detonation of Charlottetown's own depth charges as they sank with the ship into shallower water, but its effect was not in doubt. Men who had survived the first strike and were already in the water, already fighting for their lives in a cold river far from the open sea, were killed or further injured by the force of that second detonation. The river became the site of something that would have been unimaginable to the residents of the towns within sight of the smoke. Men struggling in the water, some crying out, some already beyond crying. The wreckage of a Canadian warship spreading across the surface of what had, only minutes before, been an unremarkable stretch of home water. HMCS Clayoquot, Charlottetown's companion, faced an immediate and agonizing dilemma. The standing doctrine of anti-submarine warfare was unambiguous. A ship under attack should not stop to rescue survivors, because a stopped vessel becomes a stationary target for the submarine still believed to be in the vicinity. The logic was sound. The application of it was devastating to live through, for both the rescuers and the rescued. Clayoquot's crew did what they could within the brutal constraints of that doctrine, maneuvering, attempting to locate the attacking submarine, and eventually working to pull survivors from the water when the immediate threat allowed. But the window of survival in cold water is narrow, and the second explosion had narrowed it further for many of the men already struggling to keep themselves afloat. When the accounting was done, the losses were severe. Dozens of Charlottetown's crew were gone. The precise number of those killed has been recorded in naval records, and it stands as one of the sharpest single losses suffered by the Royal Canadian Navy in the St. Lawrence campaign. Men who were not merchant sailors, not passengers, but uniformed naval personnel, the sons and brothers and husbands who had enlisted specifically to protect others from exactly this kind of death. Among those lost was the corvette's commanding officer. The survivors, those who were pulled from the river, cold and shocked, and in many cases injured, would carry the memory of that morning for the rest of their lives. Some of them spoke about it only decades later, if they spoke about it at all. The Navy moved to contain the immediate military situation. The larger strategic reality, however, was harder to contain. A Canadian warship had been sunk in the St. Lawrence River, not in the open Atlantic, not in the Gulf, not in some distant theater of war, but in the river that Canada called its own, the river from which it had built its national commerce, the river that ran past the windows of ordinary Canadians who now had to be told, carefully and obliquely, that a corvette had been lost. The censorship regime that Ottawa had put in place, already straining under the weight of the Gulf sinkings, was applied here too. Families were notified, casualty lists were processed. The public was given as little as the government judged it could get away with. But the river knew what had happened. The fishing communities knew. The lighthouse keepers knew. Suppression of fact and suppression of memory are not the same thing, and the gap between them would grow. Within the naval service itself, the loss of Charlottetown struck something deeper than institutional pride, though it struck that too. The escort service of the Royal Canadian Navy was at this point an organization of overwhelmingly young men. Men who had joined a navy that barely existed before the war, who had trained under pressure and learned by doing, who had not yet had the time or experience to build the hard professional shell that allows fighting forces to absorb loss without flinching. They knew the men aboard Charlottetown. They had served alongside them, trained beside them, drunk with them in port. The sinking was not an abstraction. It was personal, in the way that only loss within a close community can be, and its effect on the morale of escort crews operating in and around the St. Lawrence was profound and immediate. The pressure on Ottawa intensified in ways that could not be managed through censorship alone. Naval and air commanders, already arguing for more resources, more aircraft, more trained personnel, now had an undeniable symbol to place before the War Cabinet. A corvette, one of Canada's own fighting ships, had been sent to the bottom of the St. Lawrence River by a German submarine. If there had been any remaining comfort in the idea that the river itself formed some kind of natural barrier to the worst of the undersea war, that comfort was gone. The Charlottetown had been that barrier's disproof, paid for in lives. What had to follow was not simply mourning, but response. Material, political, and strategic response to a situation that could no longer be described as contained or manageable. The broader debate about the St. Lawrence, which had been building through the summer with every new sinking in the Gulf, now gained an urgency it had previously lacked. There were voices calling for the outright closure of the river and Gulf to ocean-going convoy traffic, a drastic step that would add enormous distances to Atlantic crossings and carry its own economic costs, but which would at least remove the targets from waters where Canada could not adequately protect them. There were other voices arguing that closure would itself be a form of defeat, an admission that the enemy had successfully denied Canada the use of its own maritime artery. Both sides of that argument were right, in their different ways, and the debate would continue through the autumn. But the sinking of Charlottetown had tipped the scales in a direction that was becoming impossible to resist. It is worth pausing, before moving forward into the broader consequences of that autumn, to hold the image of the corvette as she was, not as a statistic, not as a political event, but as a ship. A small, ungainly, rolling, beloved ship, built in Canada, crewed by Canadians, sent to do a job that everyone involved understood was dangerous, and lost on a bright September morning in a river where ships had no business dying. The men who served in her, who survived her, who still lived somewhere, with the memory of that second explosion, and the cold water, and the faces of those who did not make it to Clayoquot's side. They are part of what the river still carries, silently, along with everything else the war left behind. The Charlottetown rests on the bottom of the St. Lawrence to this day. The water above her moves as it always has, long and amber in the evenings, cold beneath the surface, keeping its own counsel about what it holds. In the spring of 1942, as the first German submarines penetrated the Gulf of St. Lawrence and began sinking Allied vessels in Canadian waters, a profound tension emerged in the halls of power in Ottawa. The evidence of catastrophe was undeniable. Ships were going down, men were dying, survivors were washing ashore, with stories that spread rapidly through fishing villages and coastal towns. And yet, in the offices of the Department of National Defence and the War Cabinet, a decision was made that would shape how Canadians understood their own war for decades to come. The truth would be suppressed. What followed was one of the most sweeping and comprehensive censorship regimes imposed on any Allied nation during the entire Second World War. A silence so complete that it would take the opening of classified files nearly 40 years later for Canadians to truly understand what had happened in their own territorial waters. The reasoning behind the censorship order was not born from malice or simple authoritarianism. Military strategists understood, with genuine justification, that information about the U-boat campaign's effectiveness could serve German purposes in multiple ways. If Berlin knew precisely how many ships had been sunk, where attacks were occurring, what patterns the submarines were following, German commanders could adjust their operations accordingly. If the German public knew that their submarines were successfully penetrating deep into North American waters and striking at the home territory of a nation supposedly secure behind an ocean moat, it would serve as a powerful tool for Nazi propaganda and morale. These were not frivolous concerns. The game of intelligence and counterintelligence in wartime was deadly serious, and leaks about shipping losses had already proven consequential elsewhere in the Atlantic War. From a purely military standpoint, secrecy made sense. But there was another dimension to the censorship that was less about tactical necessity and more about managing domestic anxiety. The Canadian government and military leadership knew that the public revelation of a sustained German submarine campaign inside Canadian territory would strike a psychological blow far out of proportion to the actual strategic threat posed by the U-boats. Canadians had been assured, repeatedly and publicly, that they were not in danger from German invasion or direct German attack. The country's population had been mobilized for war, yes, but the fighting was supposed to happen overseas. The idea that the enemy could reach out from the Atlantic, penetrate the nation's most vital commercial artery, and strike at civilian shipping and fishermen, practically within sight of home, was profoundly destabilizing. It shattered the comfortable fiction of distance and safety. Military planners worried, not unreasonably, that public panic could spiral, that pressure would mount for resources to be diverted from overseas operations, and that morale on the home front could be damaged in ways that would ripple through the entire war effort. What made this calculus particularly acute was the question of who would bear the consequences if censorship failed and panic did occur. The fear was not merely abstract. In the United States, when German submarines appeared off the Atlantic coast in the opening months of 1942, the lack of coordinated government messaging about shipping losses had indeed contributed to something approaching panic in some coastal communities. Rationing rumors swirled, prices spiked, militia units mobilized. The U.S. Navy had been forced to conduct elaborate beach patrols and civilian defense operations that consumed resources and diverted attention from actual anti-submarine warfare. Canadian military planners had watched this unfold with careful attention. They determined that they would not allow the same pattern to repeat in Canada. The silence order, therefore, was not simply about denying the Germans useful information. It was about controlling the Canadian public itself, about preventing the enemy's success from becoming public knowledge, and thus becoming, in a sense, more successful by creating fear and disorder beyond what the actual military situation warranted. The implementation of this censorship was remarkably thorough. Newspapers were instructed that they could not report on U-boat attacks in Canadian waters. Radio stations received similar guidance. Even personal correspondence could be subject to review if it contained details about ships going down or submarines being spotted. The Wartime Information Board, the federal agency responsible for managing news and public information during the war, worked closely with military intelligence to craft a message that acknowledged the threat existed without providing specific details about successes. When ships disappeared or were known to have been sunk, official announcements would be delayed for weeks or months, and then released in vague language that spoke of vessels being lost or damaged, without mentioning U-boats or German weapons. If a U-boat was seen, if there was sonar contact, if depth charges were dropped, newspapers received instructions that none of this could be reported until weeks later, if it could be reported at all. What made this regime particularly difficult to enforce, and ultimately to maintain, was the simple geography and demographics of the St. Lawrence. This was not the open Atlantic, where a U-boat attack could occur far from shore, and the only witnesses would be the crew of the doomed ship, and perhaps the submarine itself. The St. Lawrence was a river that flowed through populated territory. Towns and villages lined its banks. Lighthouse keepers occupied solitary posts overlooking the water. Fishermen in small boats worked the waters daily. When a ship was struck and sunk, when survivors scrambled into lifeboats, when vessels launched rescue operations, these events unfolded in front of Canadian eyes. A merchant ship torpedoed near the Gaspé Peninsula did not sink invisibly. Its hull broke apart. Its smoke rose into the sky. Men screamed. Lifeboats appeared on the water. Some survivors made it to shore, shattered and traumatized, carrying stories that could not be unheard. In fishing villages and coastal communities, the truth was not theoretical. It was tactile and immediate and undeniable. This created an extraordinary situation in which official silence collided violently with lived reality. Residents of Rimouski and other river towns knew perfectly well that ships were being sunk in the river. They had seen the fires. They had heard the explosions. Some had helped rescue survivors. Yet they opened their newspapers and read almost nothing about these events. They listened to radio broadcasts that carefully avoided any mention of what was happening in their own waters. If they tried to write letters to family members in other parts of Canada describing what they had witnessed, they had to be careful about censorship. They could tell people they had seen a ship go down, but they could not mention that it was a U-boat that had sunk it. The official narrative, insofar as it existed, suggested that perhaps there were German submarines somewhere in the Atlantic, but certainly not in the St. Lawrence, certainly not near home. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Canadians in the river communities lived in a strange liminal space where they knew one truth, and their government insisted on a different one. For the survivors themselves, this silence took on an almost crushing personal dimension. Men who had survived the sinking of a merchant ship or a warship, who had spent terrifying hours in lifeboats or clinging to wreckage, who had lost shipmates and friends, were sometimes instructed not to discuss in detail what had happened to them. Military personnel could face disciplinary action if they talked too freely. Merchant sailors, though technically civilians, faced intense pressure through various official channels not to grant interviews or provide extensive accounts to newspapers. There were undoubtedly cases in which traumatized men wanted to speak about their experiences, wanted to be heard, wanted public acknowledgement of what they had endured, and found themselves stonewalled by an apparatus of silence. Even when survivors did tell their stories, those stories were often reported in vague language that obscured the actual military circumstances. A man might be identified in a newspaper as a survivor of a vessel lost at sea, but the vessel's name might be withheld, the cause of its loss not mentioned, and the broader pattern of which it was a part entirely unacknowledged. The lighthouse keepers and coastal guards who staffed the St. Lawrence's various warning stations and observation posts occupied a particularly strange position in this landscape of enforced silence. These men saw U-boats surface. They watched periscopes break the water. They filed detailed reports of sightings and contacts that went up the chain of command to military headquarters in Quebec City and Ottawa. They were among the first to know when an attack had occurred, often hearing the distant boom of an explosion or seeing the smoke rising from a burning ship. Yet they lived in small communities where the same information was circulating among neighbors and family members through conversation. They could not prevent their communities from knowing the truth. They could only maintain official silence in their capacity as military personnel. This created peculiar social situations where men knew classified information about what was happening in their own backyard, but could not speak of it even to family members, or could speak of it only in carefully hedged language that acknowledged the situation without confirming it. The question of how long such a censorship regime could actually remain effective in a relatively free society is worth examining. The short answer is that it did remain effective as formal policy, but it fractured constantly in the spaces between official channels. People who knew the truth shared it informally. Letters passed between family members in different parts of the country. Fishermen discussed what they had seen. Survivors spoke among themselves. In the larger cities of Quebec and Montreal, newspaper editors and journalists knew more than they could print and often chafed under the restrictions. The censorship did not prevent truth-telling entirely. What it prevented was truth-telling through official, public, mass media channels. What it prevented was the large-scale collective acknowledgement of what was happening. A story heard in a coastal village and passed through informal networks was less powerful than a story that appeared in the national press or broadcast on national radio. The silence did not erase the events, but it did fragment knowledge of them, prevent the creation of a unified national narrative about the battle being fought in Canadian waters, and allowed the government to maintain the official fiction that this was a minor concern, a peripheral issue, not truly central to the Canadian experience of the war. As the summer of 1942 progressed, and U-boat attacks in the Gulf and river escalated, the pressure on the censorship regime intensified. More ships were going down. More survivors were coming ashore. The scale of the campaign was becoming impossible to ignore, even through the filter of silence. Rumors multiplied. People in inland cities who had no direct observation of events began to piece together fragments of information and construct their own narratives about what was happening on the coast. Some stories that circulated were more accurate than others. Some magnified the threat. Some minimized it. But all of them emerged in the space left by official silence. This was one of the paradoxes of the censorship. By refusing to provide a clear, authoritative account of what was actually happening, the government surrendered some control of the narrative to rumor and speculation. The public began to construct its own understanding of the battle, informed by incomplete information, survivor testimony, and the evidence of their own eyes for those living near the coast. The question of whether the censorship order actually served its intended purposes is complex and debated. Did it deny the Germans useful intelligence? Certainly to some degree, though the Germans knew roughly where their U-boats were operating and could estimate their effectiveness from other intelligence sources. Did it prevent panic? In some ways, yes, though the tension between official silence and the lived reality of coastal communities created a different kind of social disruption. Did it protect Canadian morale? Partly, though it also created resentment among those who felt patronized by the assumption that they could not be trusted with the truth about what was happening in their own waters. What it clearly did do was erase the Battle of the St. Lawrence from immediate public consciousness. It delayed the creation of a unified Canadian narrative about the campaign, and it ensured that when the war ended and the full truth of what had happened finally emerged, it would arrive with all the force of a revelation, something that had been hidden rather than something that had simply been distant. The lifting of censorship did not happen immediately when the war ended. The files remained classified for years, then decades. Researchers working in archives in the 1980s and 90s unearthed casualty figures and U-boat records and survivor accounts that had been confined to official documents for 40 years. Journalists began to write serious accounts of the battle. Historians produced detailed studies, and Canadians, many of them for the first time in their adult lives, began to understand the true scope and duration of the U-boat campaign in their own territorial waters. By then, survivors had aged. Communities had moved on. The immediate impact had been muted by the passage of time, but the rediscovery of the battle also carried with it an undertone of recrimination. Why had this been hidden? What had been protected by the silence? Some argued that the secrecy had been militarily justified. Others suggested that it had been unnecessarily paternalistic, that it had underestimated the Canadian public's ability to handle the truth and to maintain focus on the larger war effort. This debate about the censorship and its justification would become a significant part of how the battle was remembered, sometimes overshadowing the actual operational and human history of what had occurred. The irony is that the silence order, intended to maintain morale and deny the enemy information, ultimately contributed to the Battle of the St. Lawrence, becoming one of the most obscure and least understood major naval campaigns of the entire war. A battle that raged for over 3 years, that cost significant Canadian vessels and the lives of hundreds of merchant sailors, civilians, and U-boat crews, was effectively erased from the public record for 4 decades. Books about the Second World War, published in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, often contained barely a paragraph about U-boat operations in Canadian waters, if they mentioned them at all. The battle was obscured, not by German security or distance, but by the deliberate decision of the Canadian government to keep it secret from its own population. In this way, the censorship became not merely a wartime measure, but a shaping force in how the entire war was remembered and understood. The silence that began as a tactical calculation in 1942 echoed forward through decades, transforming a major military campaign into a footnote, a secret war fought in Canadian waters that even Canadians largely forgot. In the spring and early summer of 1942, the men who crewed the escort vessels of the Royal Canadian Navy faced a problem unlike anything their training had prepared them to solve. They were hunters with broken tools, searching for prey in waters that seemed designed by nature to defeat them. The St. Lawrence River and its Gulf do not forgive carelessness or inadequate equipment. The tidal forces are ferocious. The water temperature hovers near freezing, even in summer. The depths shift without warning from hundreds of meters to dangerously shallow shallows. Visibility changes with the season and the hour. The salinity varies so dramatically with the freshwater discharge from the river that early sonar could barely function at all. And somewhere in this hostile maze swam the German submarines, silent and patient, waiting for the next convoy to come within range. The weapon the Canadians relied upon most heavily was called ASDIC, an acronym that stood for Anti-Submarine Detection Investigation Committee, though the men who operated it often felt that the name was the only thing working as intended. ASDIC was an active sonar system that could, under optimal conditions, detect a submarine's hull at a distance of perhaps 2,000 meters or a bit more. But the conditions in the St. Lawrence were almost never optimal. The sonar operator sat in a small compartment below the waterline, wearing headphones, listening for the distinctive echo that would bounce back from a submerged hull. On good days, when the water was stable and the acoustics cooperative, it was a system that had shown promise in the English Channel and around Britain. But here, in the vast Gulf and in the river itself, ASDIC became unreliable, finicky, prone to generating false contacts and missing submarines that were actually there. The thermal layers that formed in the water column during summer months created acoustic shadows that submarines learned to use as cover. The sediment stirred up by the tidal currents created a sonar noise that sometimes made the entire water column sound like it was alive, with phantom targets. Men spent hours with headphones clamped to their ears, straining to distinguish signal from noise, knowing that the cost of a mistake was measured in lost ships and drowned sailors. Shortage of aircraft made the situation even more desperate. Long-range patrol aviation was perhaps the single most effective anti-submarine weapon the Allies had developed by 1942, at least when given sufficient range and equipped with the latest radar and electronic detection equipment. But the Royal Canadian Air Force, stretched thin across an entire nation and an ocean, did not have enough patrol squadrons to cover the St. Lawrence adequately. The aircraft that did operate in the Gulf were often elderly machines, short-ranged, lightly armed, equipped with whatever detection equipment could be spared from more critical theaters. A single squadron might be responsible for patrol coverage over hundreds of kilometers of water, with the result that vast stretches of the Gulf and river went unwatched for hours at a time. When a U-boat captain wished to attack a convoy, he could often choose his moment with reasonable confidence that no aircraft would arrive during the critical minutes of an engagement. The Germans knew this. The Canadian commanders knew this too. And the knowledge festered like an infection, a constant reminder of inferiority that no amount of courage or dedication could overcome. Yet the men pressed on regardless. The corvettes and minesweepers that formed the escort groups were small, tough ships, many of them newly built in Canadian yards, crewed by men who had been civilians just months before. They operated on what was called the convoy cycle, a rhythmic rotation that became the structure of their entire lives. A convoy would assemble over the course of a day or two, merchant vessels of all kinds gathering at a designated rendezvous point, bringing cargoes that ranged from grain to munitions to military personnel bound for overseas. The escort vessels, usually numbering between 4 and 8 ships, would take up positions around the merchant fleet, attempting to keep the slower vessels together in some semblance of formation. Then came the passage itself, which might take anywhere from 3 to 6 days depending on the size of the convoy and the hazards that had to be navigated. For most of that passage, nothing happened. The ships steamed in their stations, day following day, with grinding monotony. The men stood watch, 4 hours on and 8 hours off, or some variation designed to keep them perpetually tired but not quite asleep. They performed maintenance on equipment they knew was marginal. They checked weapons that would not arrive in time to make a difference. They waited. The waiting was its own form of ordeal. A convoy escort operation was mostly boredom, suffused with a permanent baseline of anxiety that had nowhere to discharge itself. The men knew the threat was real because they had seen the evidence. They had picked up survivors from torpedoed vessels. They had seen the oil slicks and floating debris. Some of them had been present when a merchant ship was hit, had watched her break in half and slip beneath the surface in minutes, while men in lifeboats screamed for rescue that often came too late. But for hours and hours, sometimes for entire passages, there was nothing to do but scan an empty horizon and listen to the crackling of the radio. Some men developed a kind of mental numbness, a dissociation that was almost protective. Others became hyper-vigilant. Every sound from the engine room, a possible U-boat. Every unusual wave pattern, a possible periscope. The psychological strain was immense and largely unacknowledged. There was no stress leave, no counseling, no recognition that watching for an enemy who might come from anywhere at any time was a form of strain that could break men down just as surely as combat itself. And then, sometimes with horrifying abruptness, the waiting would end. A lookout would spot something. A sonar operator would report a contact. A distress signal would crackle over the radio. In those moments, the routine shattered. The convoy would scatter, each merchant vessel attempting to put distance between itself and its neighbors, making it harder for a U-boat to find a profitable target. The escort vessels would race toward the contact, their small crews running to battle stations, their officers calling out orders informed more by hope than by tactical doctrine that was still being invented in real time. Depth charges would be rolled off the stern, sinking down into the darkness to detonate at preset depths, sending up columns of water that the men hoped, without any real confidence, might contain the submarine. The ASDIC operator, suddenly not bored at all, but instead terrified, would be calling out ranges and bearings to the commanding officer, who had to decide whether his ship was going to ram the submarine, try to depth charge it, or risk moving away and losing the contact entirely. Other escort vessels would converge on the spot, adding their own weapons to the attack, creating a coordinated assault that looked, from a distance, like it might actually accomplish something. But the submarines were small and maneuverable. The acoustic conditions were terrible. The weapons were inaccurate. More often than not, the U-boat escaped into the depths, leaving only the frustrated escorts behind, wondering if they had even been attacking a real contact, or if it had been noise all along. The physical and emotional toll of these sudden transitions from boredom to terror was not easily measured, but was universally acknowledged by the men who endured it. A naval officer who commanded an escort vessel in 1942 would later describe the experience as far more exhausting than any period of continuous action would have been, because the body never knew how to settle into a sustainable state of alertness. Either you were not ready at all, in which case a U-boat attack would catch you unprepared, or you were maximally ready, muscles tense, mind racing, adrenaline flowing, and that state could not be sustained indefinitely. Men made mistakes because they were tired. They sometimes fired on false contacts because they desperately wanted to do something, anything, that might convince themselves that they were not entirely helpless. The Canadian naval records from 1942 are filled with after-action reports describing attacks on contacts that were never confirmed as actual submarines, attacks that consumed ammunition and time and energy for no verifiable result. There is no shame in these reports, only a kind of honest frustration about the impossibility of the task they had been given. The improvised tactics that Canadian commanders developed on the ground were creative and sometimes effective, born from desperation and the necessity to operate with inadequate tools. Convoy routes were varied constantly, attempting to deny the U-boats the ability to predict where ships would be and set up ambushes. Speed was deliberately varied, fast convoys alternating with slow ones, making it harder for submarines to maintain contact. Evasive maneuvers were incorporated into the convoy doctrine, with escorts attempting to place themselves between a detected submarine and the merchant ships they were supposed to protect. Some commanders experimented with tighter convoy formations to make it harder for U-boats to position themselves for attack. Others tried the opposite approach, spreading ships out to make the convoy harder to hit as a whole. There was a kind of tactical innovation happening in real time, driven by necessity and informed by bitter experience. When a particular tactic seemed to work, word would spread through the escort service. When something failed, the lessons were bitter but absorbed. The Canadian naval commanders of 1942 were not operating with the accumulated wisdom of decades of convoy escort operations. They were writing that wisdom as they went, with the price of failure paid in ships and lives. But for all the innovation and courage, there remained a fundamental inequality between the hunter and the hunted. The submarine captain chose when and where the engagement would occur. He could approach unseen, fire his torpedo from a range at which the escort could not possibly respond, and then either slip away into the depths, or, if he was confident and bold, surface to use his deck gun on a crippled merchant vessel. The escort vessels, by contrast, had to maintain their stations around the convoy, unable to chase a submarine contact beyond a certain point without abandoning their fundamental responsibility to the ships they were supposed to protect. If a U-boat sank a vessel at the rear of the convoy and then ran at high speed for deep water, the escorts could not pursue aggressively without leaving the rest of the convoy vulnerable. They had to return to their defensive stations and hope that the next passage would be better. The next convoy would not be attacked. The next contact would result in a confirmed kill. That hope, week after week, proved hollow. The losses continued. The escorts remained outgunned and undersupplied, and the men aboard those escort vessels knew it with a clarity that no amount of official optimism could dispel. The few successful anti-submarine actions that Canadian forces achieved during 1942 were celebrated because they were so rare. When a U-boat was actually sunk by a Canadian escort or aircraft, the victory was amplified, distributed through the service, as proof that the enemy could be beaten. But the truth was far grimmer. For most of 1942, the submarines operated in the St. Lawrence and Gulf with near impunity. The escort vessels, for all their efforts, for all the courage of their crews, could not prevent the steady accumulation of losses. The aircraft, when they appeared, sometimes made a U-boat captain hesitate or alter his approach. But even these rare interventions seldom resulted in confirmed kills. The hunters were searching in darkness, armed with inadequate weapons, operating in conditions that seemed specifically designed to defeat them. They were exhausted and under-equipped, and they knew it. The weight of that knowledge, carried day after day through the routines of the convoy cycle, was perhaps the most destructive weapon the Germans had deployed against the Canadian escort service. It was not the U-boats themselves that broke morale, so much as the grinding certainty that there was no way to win the game as it was being played, that the only hope for change would have to come from outside, from some kind of reinforcement or technological advantage, or shift in the broader strategy that men at sea could not control or predict. They continued to do their duty, because that was what was expected of them. But the hope that they would be sufficient to the task died during the summer and autumn of 1942, and it would take months of restructuring and reinforcement to revive it. The war at sea was never one war. It was two wars, fought in parallel by men who would never meet, but whose fates were bound together as tightly as the steel hull that separated them. On one side of the battle line lay the Canadian sailors and airmen, scrambling through the spring and summer of 1942 to defend the St. Lawrence. On the other lay the German submariners, a different breed of warrior, moving through the darkness in machines that were as much coffins as they were weapons. To understand what happened in those cold Canadian waters, we must cross that dividing line and look through the periscope of the hunter, not merely the hunted. The Type X U-boat was a marvel of engineering and a tomb waiting to happen. Nearly 300 feet in length, displacing more than 1,000 tons when submerged. It was the workhorse of Admiral Dönitz's expanded Atlantic campaign. The boat was designed for endurance, for weeks-long patrols across the vast grey emptiness of the open ocean, where a submarine could rise and fall like a whale through an infinite sea. But the St. Lawrence River was no ocean. It was a confined space, a waterway where the enemy could see the shore from the bridge of a destroyer, where the water grew shallower as one moved inland, where the bottom rose up with terrible suddenness, in places where a captain's map was wrong by even a few hundred meters. The Type 9 was a weapon built for the Atlantic scale, now squeezed into a space where there was nowhere to hide and no margin for error. The men who crewed these boats were professionals, in most cases volunteers, many of them young enough that the only peace they had known was already fading from memory. The average U-boat captain was in his early 30s, a career naval officer who had been blooded in the Spanish Civil War or the Norwegian campaign, a man who had studied the mathematics of ballast and buoyancy until it became intuition. The crew, numbering perhaps 50 or so souls aboard a Type 9, included engineers, sonarmen, torpedo specialists, and lookouts, many of them in their early 20s, conscripted or recruited for a service that promised danger and, if luck turned, a kind of grim glory. The forward compartments, where the enlisted men slept in rotating shifts on mattresses laid across the torpedo tubes, were spaces where a man lying down could reach out in the dark and touch both the curved metal wall beside him and the body of another sailor. Heat, sweat, diesel fumes, the musty stench of 100 men living in a sealed steel box. These were the ordinary conditions of submarine life, tolerable in the open Atlantic, but somehow more oppressive in the confined waters of the Gulf and river. The decision to push U-boats into the St. Lawrence was made in Berlin, but the decision to stay was made by the men who commanded them. The tactical advantages were real and compelling. In the narrow waters of the river, a submarine could lie motionless on the bottom, engines shut down, waiting in absolute silence while listening for the sound of a convoy or escort vessel. The acoustic properties of the river bottom, the layers of fresh water mixing with salt, the cold currents, and the murky visibility, all of these things that tormented the Canadian defenders, were potential allies to a skilled boat commander. The shallowness of the river meant that an escort vessel's depth charges could miss entirely, detonating harmlessly far below the submarine's true position. A German captain, who knew the channel well enough, could navigate nearly blind through the darkness, surfacing only when necessary, disappearing again into the murk before the enemy could organize a response. In the open Atlantic, a U-boat was merely predatory. In the St. Lawrence, it became something closer to supernatural, a phantom with agency and will. But the advantages came at a cost that grew more terrible with each passing week. The navigation itself was an act of sustained courage and concentration. The St. Lawrence River is a waterway of violent tidal currents, sudden shallows, and unforgiving geography. A U-boat captain, accustomed to the Atlantic's predictability, where one could navigate by stars and calculation, now had to trust in charts that were often inaccurate, in depths that changed with the tide, in a river that had no mercy for miscalculation. The sonar operators, men who had trained for years to interpret the echoes bouncing off open water, found their instruments nearly useless in the confused acoustic environment of the river. Where was the bottom? Where was the shore? In the darkness and the strange, overlapping echoes of the confined space, even experienced submariners could lose their sense of where they actually were. More than one U-boat ran aground in the St. Lawrence, trapped by the tide and the geography, forced to blow its ballast tanks and flee on the surface under cover of darkness, a humiliating exposure that nevertheless kept the boat from sinking. The experience of lying on the bottom waiting to be hunted was a form of psychological torture that no training could adequately prepare a man for. When the hydrophones on the surface reported an escort vessel approaching, the submarine would descend into what the German crews called the Tiefenruhe, the deep silence. The engines would be shut down completely. The men would be ordered to stop moving, to hold their breath, to become absolutely motionless in the darkness. The only sounds would be the distant, growing rumble of the escort vessel's engines, transmitted through the water, like the tread of an invisible giant approaching through the dark. The men would sit in their compartments, pressing their ears against the steel, listening, waiting, unable to move, unable to speak, knowing that the slightest noise, a cough, a dropped tool, the involuntary clang of metal against metal, might betray their position and bring death from above. The psychological strain of these hours was immense. Fear, it turned out, was a sound. The terrible knowledge that at any moment the sky could open up with explosions. The boat could begin to take water. The hull could collapse inward with the weight of the water above. Men who had seemed brave enough in daylight sometimes broke in these hours, weeping silently in the darkness, gripping the arms of others to keep themselves from screaming. The depth charges themselves had become more numerous and better coordinated as the Canadians improved their tactics. A single depth charge was frightening, a pattern of them, detonating in a carefully calculated sequence around the submarine's position, was something altogether different. The concussive force of explosions in water was almost impossible to anticipate or fully describe to someone who had not experienced it. The shockwaves could crack glass, rupture the compressed air lines that ran through the boat, tear instruments from their mountings, shatter the eardrums of men standing too close to the hull. More than one U-boat was damaged, not by having its hull punctured, but by having its interior systems destroyed by the force of detonations. The hull itself had to withstand enormous pressure, and a near miss from a depth charge could bend the structure just enough to cause slow leaks, to distort the seals around torpedo tubes, to create the constant, maddening sound of water trickling in somewhere, everywhere, threatening to become a flood. And yet the U-boats kept returning. Admiral Dönitz ordered them back into the St. Lawrence, again and again, long after the strategic value of the campaign had become marginal. Whether this was stubborn refusal to accept the shifting balance of the Atlantic War, or whether there were still tonnage figures that looked impressive in Berlin dispatches, remains a matter of interpretation. But the captains who received these orders and who piloted their boats back through the Cabot Strait and into the river did so knowing that the conditions had deteriorated, that the Canadian defences had grown more numerous and more skilled, that operating in these waters had shifted from a calculated risk to something very close to suicide. The men aboard these boats were patriots in their fashion, trained warriors who had volunteered for a service that asked more of them than was reasonable. But they were also men who had wives waiting in places like Kiel or Hamburg, men who understood that death was a statistical inevitability for many of them, and who nevertheless kept boarding the submarines and sealing the hatches behind them. The loss of the first crew members killed in action had a particular weight to it. In the early weeks of the campaign, when the U-boats were still novelties in these waters, and the Canadian defences were primitive, the U-boat crews had held something close to contempt for their opposition. But as casualties accumulated, boats damaged, men killed in action on both sides of the battle, the machinery of war grinding into motion, that contempt gave way to caution, then to something darker. The U-boats that had operated in the St. Lawrence in 1942 had been commanded by some of the most experienced captains in the German fleet. These were men who had already been to war twice, who understood the odds, and who now found themselves in a position where those odds had shifted against them in ways they could not fully control. The river itself had become the enemy, as much as the Canadian destroyers and depth charges. A U-boat could kill from stealth. The river could kill without warning. The food aboard a U-boat was better than the German army's rations. a deliberate policy meant to maintain the morale of men living in conditions of genuine hardship. But after weeks on patrol, especially in the cold of the St. Lawrence, the food became monotonous and took on the taste of the submarine's recycled air. There were potatoes, preserved vegetables, a kind of dry sausage called leberwurst that could sustain a man but brought no joy. Coffee had to be made from the precious freshwater supplies, and hot meals became less frequent as fuel consumption was carefully rationed. The men grew thin on these patrols, not from hunger exactly, but from the cumulative effect of stress and confinement, and the strange, disrupted sleep that came from living in a boat where day and night had no meaning, where the lighting never changed, where time itself seemed to become unmoored from the ordinary world. The mail from home, when it came, was both a blessing and a curse. Letters from wives, lovers, mothers. These represented a connection to a world that seemed impossibly distant and unreal. A man in a submarine could hold a letter in his hands and read about the ordinary life continuing in Germany, about children growing, about the gardens his family had planted, about the hope that the war would end soon and everything would return to normal. But that same letter also carried the weight of love and expectation, the knowledge that people on the other side of the ocean were depending on a man's return, believing in his survival. When a submarine was lost, when it failed to return from patrol, the letters that men had written, but not yet sent, were sometimes recovered and sent to their families, small echoes of a voice that would never speak again. The German Naval Command had known for years that submarine warfare against merchant shipping, no matter how successful tactically, could not win the war. This was a strategic reality understood even in 1942, though it was rarely spoken aloud. But Dönitz operated in a command structure that valued tonnage sunk above almost all other considerations. Every merchant ship destroyed meant fewer supplies reaching Britain, meant Canadian and American resources committed to defense rather than offense, meant that the mathematical equation of the Atlantic War was still, or so the calculations suggested, being pushed in Germany's favor. The men aboard the U-boats knew that they were part of a larger calculation, that their success or failure would be measured in spreadsheets in Berlin. But they were also men who wanted to go home, who wanted their wives to not receive a telegram, who had learned through hard experience that the seemingly invincible German Navy was not invincible, and that every patrol might be the last. By late 1942 and into 1943, as Canadian defenses improved and U-boat losses in the St. Lawrence began to mount, a certain grim professionalism settled over both the hunters and the hunted. The U-boat captains who returned to Canadian waters after the summer of 1942 were different men than those who had departed 6 months earlier. They were scarred by experience, more cautious, more aware of the precise limits of what their boats could accomplish and what they could survive. They operated with a kind of doomed competence, moving through waters that had become hostile in ways that the open Atlantic had never been, knowing that they remained dangerous predators even as they themselves had become prey. The river kept its secrets, the depths concealed the wrecks, and the waters of the St. Lawrence carried the stories of men who had descended into the darkness and had not returned, on both sides of the line that separated the watchers above from the watchers below. By the autumn of 1942, the Battle of the St. Lawrence had already claimed dozens of merchant vessels and one Canadian warship. Yet the war along the river and Gulf remained, to most Canadians, a distant abstraction, something whispered about, something the government had seen fit to keep from public view. The censorship that had begun in the spring had done its work so thoroughly that people in inland cities like Toronto and Winnipeg had no concrete sense of what was truly happening in the waters east of Quebec. But in the small communities of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, in the fishing villages and port towns scattered along the Atlantic coast, people knew better. They had seen the smoke. They had heard the explosions. They had pulled survivors from the sea. On the 14th of October 1942, all the silences and half-truths that had sustained the official narrative would shatter at once. The SS Caribou was not a warship, nor a cargo vessel, bristling with strategic materiel. She was a passenger ferry, a vessel designed for the comfort and safety of civilians. A modest, 9,000-ton ship that had carried people back and forth across the Cabot Strait, between Sydney, Nova Scotia, and Port aux Basques, Newfoundland, since the 1920s. On that autumn day, the Caribou was making one of her regular runs, having departed Sydney in the early hours, with a complement of 237 souls aboard, crew members, military personnel, merchant sailors awaiting passage to other ports, and civilian passengers, among them women, children, and elderly people who had no reason whatsoever to believe they were sailing into the presence of a German U-boat. The crossing of the Cabot Strait was a journey of less than 100 kilometers, typically completed in roughly 10 hours of daylight travel. It was a crossing so familiar, so routine, that it seemed impossible anything could go wrong on such a well-traveled, well-known route. But familiarity had become, by October of 1942, a liability rather than a comfort. The captain of the Caribou was a man named Angus J. MacDonald, not to be confused with the Canadian politician of the same name, an experienced master mariner who had commanded the ferry through dozens of crossings without incident. In the early afternoon, with the strait ahead and the Newfoundland coast still some distance away, MacDonald and his crew had no indication that danger was near. The day was unremarkable. Autumn weather, typical Atlantic conditions, no sign of enemy activity. The official report, filed later by survivors and by those who investigated the disaster, would reveal that no anti-submarine precautions were in effect. The Caribou was running no zigzag course, no evasive pattern, relying instead on her designation as a passenger vessel and the assumption that she was too small, too civilian, too insignificant to merit the attention of a U-boat commander. It was a calculation made by many ship captains in these waters during 1942. On this day, it proved catastrophically wrong. The submarine stalking the Cabot Strait was the U-691, commanded by Hans Jebsen, a relatively junior officer commanding one of Germany's Type Vic U-boats, smaller and less capable than the Type 9 boats that had prowled the river itself, but no less lethal to a defenseless passenger ferry. Jebsen and his crew had penetrated the Gulf of St. Lawrence following the same general route as their predecessors, and they were actively searching for targets of opportunity when the Caribou crossed their path. From the U-boat's periscope, the ferry would have appeared exactly as she was, an unescorted, slow-moving, defenseless vessel carrying no obvious military cargo and no apparent military purpose beyond the transportation of people. To a submarine commander operating under orders to sink any Allied shipping, regardless of cargo or designation, the Caribou represented a legitimate target. At roughly 14-15 hours, Jebsen fired a single torpedo. The impact came without warning. Survivors who lived through the next moments would struggle for the rest of their lives to describe the sensation of the explosion. That sudden, incomprehensible rupture of the ship's hull, the violent lurch, the cascade of fear and confusion that engulfed everyone aboard in the instant between the life they had known and the catastrophe unfolding around them. The torpedo struck the Caribou on her starboard side amidships, tearing through the hull and penetrating deep into the ship's structure. The damage was catastrophic and immediately apparent to everyone aboard. The Caribou had not struck a rock or encountered mechanical failure. She had been struck by an enemy weapon while sailing in supposedly safe Canadian waters. For the crew, the knowledge that they were now engaged in a battle, that they had become participants in the war, whether they wished to or not, struck with almost the same violence as the torpedo itself. Captain MacDonald reacted with the professionalism of a lifetime at sea, ordering his crew to abandon ship and directing passengers toward the lifeboats with whatever calm authority he could muster under the most urgent circumstances imaginable. But the Caribou was sinking fast, far faster than the orderly evacuation of more than 200 people could be accomplished. The autumn Atlantic in October is brutally cold, the water in the Cabot Strait hovering only marginally above freezing, and the ship was listing heavily, her bow already sinking deeper as the sea poured through the wound opened by the torpedo. Panic became inevitable. Some passengers and crew members were thrown into the water as the ship rolled. Others found themselves struggling to launch lifeboats from davits that were themselves becoming angled and useless as the vessel tilted. Still others simply jumped, preferring the immediate shock of cold water to the certainty of going down with the ship. In the chaos, decisions that had been made in seconds, who would be in which boat, who would survive, and who would not, began to determine life and death with the terrible arbitrariness of catastrophe. 97 people aboard the Caribou went down with the ship. Among them was Captain Angus J. MacDonald himself, who remained aboard to assist in the evacuation and was still on deck when the Caribou's bow disappeared beneath the surface, roughly 30 minutes after she had been struck. 40 more people died in the lifeboats or in the water in the hours that followed, succumbing to the paralytic cold, to injuries sustained in the panic and confusion, or to the simple fact that the human body cannot long endure immersion in water only a few degrees above freezing. The wreck itself sank to a depth of roughly 350 meters on the floor of the Cabot Strait, coming to rest in darkness among the wrecks of all the other vessels that the U-boats had claimed since the beginning of the campaign in May. 100 people, just under half of those aboard, would survive, pulled from the water and the lifeboats by the Canadian minesweeper Shawinigan, which had been in the vicinity and raced to the scene of the disaster upon receiving the distress signals. For these survivors, the trauma of what they had experienced would mark the rest of their lives. The response to the sinking of the Caribou was immediate and overwhelming along the Atlantic coast. In Port aux Basques and Sydney, in the small towns and villages of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, families gathered to learn whether their relatives or friends had been among those who made it to the lifeboats, or among those who did not. The disaster struck with a force and visibility that no amount of official censorship could obscure, because the Caribou had been carrying not only cargo and military personnel, but passengers, civilians, who had boarded a supposedly safe civilian vessel for a routine crossing and had not come back. Word spread like fire through communities, already anxious about the U-boat war. Newspapers that had been publishing heavily censored accounts of scattered merchant vessel losses suddenly found themselves confronted with an undeniable tragedy that could not be suppressed or minimized without straining credibility beyond the breaking point. The censorship regime that had been so carefully constructed by the Canadian government, the deliberate suppression of news about U-boat attacks in the St. Lawrence and Gulf, had been predicated on the assumption that the public would accept official silence, provided they received no direct evidence to the contrary. But the Caribou disaster shattered that delicate equilibrium. Here was a passenger ship carrying civilians, sunk in Canadian waters by a German submarine. Here were survivors who had been picked up by Canadian naval vessels, who were present in communities across the Atlantic coast, who could tell their stories to newspapers, to family members, to anyone who would listen. The government and the military could maintain censorship on the operational details of the campaign, on which U-boats were operating where, on the precise locations of sinkings, on the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of Canadian countermeasures. But they could not prevent the public from learning that the Caribou had gone down, or that many of those aboard her had died. The disaster forced a reckoning that Ottawa had been hoping to avoid. In the days and weeks following the loss of the Caribou, Canadian newspapers began publishing accounts that, while still constrained by the censorship apparatus, revealed far more detail about the U-boat campaign than had previously been allowed into print. The government's press releases, which for months had been issuing vague statements about incidents and losses, suddenly became more forthright. Families of crew members and passengers who had died or been reported missing received official notification. Survivor testimonies, published in newspapers and circulated through communities, created a narrative of the disaster that was at once heroic. The bravery of the crew, the rescue efforts of the Shawinigan, and devastating in its clarity about what had actually occurred. The Caribou was not an abstraction or a distant wartime loss. She was a ship that local people had seen, that many had traveled aboard, that had connected their communities to each other. Her loss was personal, in a way that earlier sinkings had been able to remain obscure. The psychological and political impact of the Caribou disaster cannot be overstated. It would become, in many respects, the defining event of the Battle of the St. Lawrence. Not because it was the largest loss of life in the campaign overall, but because it was the largest loss of civilian life, and because it occurred in a context of systematic government censorship that made the disaster appear, to the Canadian public, as evidence that they had been deliberately deceived about the scope and severity of the threat to their own waters. Survivors who had lost family members, communities that had lost members of their own, felt betrayed by the official silence that had preceded the disaster. If the government had been more forthright about the submarine threat earlier in the campaign, residents of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia asked, would people have made different choices about their travels? Would the captain and crew of the Caribou have exercised greater caution? These questions could not be answered, but they would persist for decades. The disaster transformed the Battle of the St. Lawrence from a wartime incident that could be managed through censorship into an undeniable, visible fact of Canadian military experience, one that had claimed civilian lives in the St. Lawrence waters, on Canadian soil, within the protective radius of the Canadian state. In the aftermath of the Caribou, the pressure on the Canadian government to act decisively against the U-boat threat intensified dramatically. Public opinion, inflamed by the disaster and by the revelation that the threat had been far worse than official statements had suggested, demanded visible measures, evidence that the Navy and Air Force were taking the campaign seriously and protecting Canadian citizens. The months that followed the disaster would see a dramatic escalation in Canadian anti-submarine efforts, an acceleration of the military buildup that had begun earlier in the year. The Caribou had not altered the fundamental strategic situation in the St. Lawrence. The submarines would continue to operate, and Canadian forces would continue to struggle against them through 1943, but it had shattered the illusion that the war could be fought in Canadian waters, while maintaining a facade of normalcy at home. From the autumn of 1942 onward, the reality of what was happening in the St. Lawrence would be increasingly difficult for any Canadian to ignore, whether they lived in the coastal regions where the battle was being fought, or in the distant cities of the interior, where the war had previously seemed safely remote. The Caribou had brought the war home in a way that no amount of official statement or military communique could reverse. By the autumn of 1942, the men and women of Canada faced an impossible choice. The St. Lawrence River, which had fed the nation's war effort and connected it to the wider struggle across the Atlantic, had become a liability so acute that keeping it open meant accepting regular losses of ships and lives in waters that should have been safe. The submarines were still coming. More attacks were reported almost weekly through September and into October. The sinkings were happening closer to shore, in shallower water, with greater frequency and audacity. And despite the frantic efforts of the Royal Canadian Navy and Royal Canadian Air Force to organize defenses, the U-boats were winning. The government in Ottawa faced mounting pressure from military commanders, from shipping interests, and from communities along the river and Gulf Coast who demanded action. Something had to give. The choice, when it finally came, would reshape the entire logistics of the war effort and mark an admission that Canada, despite all its courage and determination, simply could not defend the river that was its lifeblood. The sinking of the Caribou in early autumn pushed the crisis to its breaking point. The passenger ferry, carrying more than 200 souls on what should have been a routine crossing of the Cabot Strait, had gone down in darkness, with catastrophic loss of life. Unlike the merchant ships that had been disappearing all summer, the Caribou was known, visible, and its loss could not be hidden from the public. Families in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland knew people on that ship. Letters stopped arriving. Men and women who had survived their journey across the Atlantic to visit relatives at home never made it back. The silence imposed by censorship could not contain this disaster. The news leaked, rumors spread, and suddenly, the war that had seemed distant to many Canadians became terrifyingly immediate. The government faced an outcry that it could no longer manage through press suppression. Something had to change, and change it did. The decision that followed would be one of the most consequential of the entire war effort in the Canadian theatre, and it would be made not by the admirals, but by the politicians, forced to choose between accepting continuing losses or accepting a massive, humiliating disruption to the nation's entire maritime economy. In the autumn months of 1942, the St. Lawrence was carrying roughly 80% of Canada's overseas trade. Ships loaded with grain from the prairie provinces, with lumber from the forests of Quebec and Ontario, with aluminum and other war materials, poured down the river toward the Gulf and then out into the Atlantic, bound for Britain and the Soviet Union. The river was the artery through which Canada's war economy flowed outward to sustain the Allied cause. It was faster than the alternative routes around Newfoundland, faster by a margin of several hundred kilometers of sailing distance. For ships already operating on thin margins of fuel and vulnerable to attack for days longer than necessary, those hundreds of kilometers meant the difference between a manageable voyage and an exhausting ordeal. Closing the St. Lawrence meant condemning every ship that used it to a longer, more dangerous journey. It meant adding weeks to supply chains already strained to breaking. It meant frustrating the entire apparatus of war production that Canada had so painfully constructed. Yet the military logic had become unavoidable. The submarines were in the river. The Canadian Navy could not get them out, and every day that ocean-going traffic continued through the Gulf meant more targets for men in U-boats who seemed to be operating with near impunity. The debate within the War Cabinet in Ottawa grew heated as the autumn deepened. The Minister of Transport and the shipbuilding and shipping interests that surrounded him argued passionately that closure was not merely economically damaging, but strategically mistaken. Closing the St. Lawrence would disrupt the entire flow of supplies to Britain at a moment when the Allies were locked in a desperate struggle on multiple fronts. The convoys forming in the Gulf, despite their losses, were still delivering cargo. The risk to individual ships was real, but the strategic benefit of using the river remained substantial. Diverting traffic around Newfoundland would mean fewer ships arriving in Britain, fewer supplies delivered, a slower build-up of resources for the invasion that everyone knew was coming. The military commanders, by contrast, had a simpler argument. The Navy could not protect the St. Lawrence. The Air Force could not patrol it adequately. The submarines would continue to sink ships for as long as ships continued to sail. Every loss was a failure of Canadian defenses and an embarrassment that grew more acute with each attack. Either the Navy needed more ships and aircraft to seal the river, which Canada could not provide, or the ships had to go elsewhere. There was no middle ground. The politicians listened to both sides, weighed the arguments, and understood that any decision they made would be wrong in some fundamental way. What finally broke the deadlock was not a new argument, but a new attack. In late September, shortly after the Caribou had gone down, another ship was torpedoed in the Gulf. Then another followed days later. The submarines seemed emboldened, operating with the confidence of predators that had learned their hunting ground and knew that their prey was defenseless. The casualty figures from the summer and autumn of 1942 in the St. Lawrence were now approaching totals that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Roughly 24 ships had been sunk in the Gulf and river since May. The losses in lives were in the hundreds. The losses in cargo were in the tens of thousands of tons. Every day of debate meant another potential sinking, another family learning that their son or father or brother was not coming home, another cargo destined for Britain resting on the bottom of the river. The government made its decision. The St. Lawrence River would be closed to all ocean-going convoy traffic, effective immediately. All shipping would be rerouted around Newfoundland and through the Strait of Belle Isle, adding between 400 and 500 kilometers to every voyage. The news was delivered to the shipping companies, the port authorities, and the military commanders with a finality that brooked no argument. By October, the first of the rerouted convoys were beginning their longer journey around the northern coast of Newfoundland. The practical consequences of the closure were staggering. Every ship that had previously been routed through the St. Lawrence now faced a significantly extended voyage. A run that might have taken 10 days through the river could now take 14 or 15 days around the longer, colder, more exposed northern route. Those extra days meant extra fuel consumption, extra wear on engines, and extra exposure to danger. Ships that might previously have had the benefit of traveling in organized convoys could now find themselves isolated for longer stretches of their journey, or forced into slower convoys that had to move at the pace of the oldest and most decrepit vessel in their formation. The accumulation of delayed arrivals at ports in Britain and North Africa began almost immediately. Convoys that should have arrived in Liverpool or Glasgow in early November did not appear until mid-November. Supplies that were needed in North Africa to support the coming offensive against Rommel arrived weeks late. The entire rhythm of the Allied war effort in the Atlantic began to contract, to slow, to feel the weight of those extra hundreds of kilometers added to every journey. The War Office in London sent increasingly pointed cables to Ottawa, asking if the closure was really necessary, whether the problem could not be managed some other way. The Canadian government's answer was always the same. The submarines could not be contained. The river could not be defended. The closure would remain in effect for as long as the threat persisted. The economic impact on Canada was profound and immediate. The Maritimes, dependent on shipping, and the services that surrounded it, felt the slowdown acutely. Port workers in Quebec City and Montreal found their schedules disrupted. Grain elevators, that had been feeding a steady stream of ships, now saw their operations backlogged. The railway system that moved freight to the river's edge found itself struggling with a sudden surplus of cargo that had nowhere to go. Shipyards that had been building escorts for the St. Lawrence operations shifted their focus to other vessels. The merchant marine, that essential but often overlooked component of the war effort, found itself reorganizing around new realities. Insurance rates for ships using the longer route did not increase, but the underlying risk had. Every ship now spent more time at sea, more time vulnerable, more time away from home. The men aboard those ships felt the closure most acutely. A voyage that might once have kept them away from their families for 3 months now kept them away for 4 or even 5. A journey from Halifax to the United Kingdom that once meant 10 or 12 days in the danger zone now meant 14 or 16 days. The cumulative effect on morale was real, even if it was rarely discussed openly in wartime. Yet the closure also represented something else, an admission of strategic reality that, while humiliating, was also clarifying. Canada could not defend the St. Lawrence. The nation's Navy and Air Force, expanded with remarkable speed and showing genuine courage and dedication, were simply not equipped with the numbers, the training, or the equipment necessary to seal off one of the world's longest and most complex navigable waterways against an enemy equipped with modern submarines. This was not a failure of will or of effort. It was a failure of resources. The Royal Canadian Navy had grown from fewer than 10,000 men in 1941 to more than 90,000 by 1943. But much of that growth was in training and organization rather than in finished combat vessels. The corvettes and Fairmile launches that formed the backbone of the escort service were capable ships, but they were not adequate to the task of protecting a river 500 kilometers long and hundreds of kilometers wide. The Air Force had more aircraft available by the autumn of 1942 than it had had in the spring, but it still lacked the long-range patrol machines and the density of coverage that the St. Lawrence required. Closing the river was, in a sense, an admission that the war was bigger than Canada's ability to defend home waters. It was an acknowledgement that the nation had to accept risk in one place in order to concentrate resources elsewhere. The closure also revealed something about the nature of the war itself and about Canada's place within the larger Allied effort. The United States, with its vast industrial capacity and its enormous navy, could absorb the losses along its eastern seaboard in 1942 and continue to function. The submarines sank ships off the coast of Florida and the Carolinas and the mouth of the Hudson River, but the United States had the resources to defend, to rebuild, to continue. Canada, with its much smaller population and economy, could not afford that luxury. The closure of the St. Lawrence was not optional, it was necessary, and accepting that necessity meant accepting that Canada was fighting a war within someone else's war, that the nation's resources were constrained, that there were limits to what could be defended and what must be abandoned to the enemy. This recognition, hard as it was to swallow, actually clarified Canadian strategy for the remainder of the conflict. Resources would be concentrated where they could be effective. The Navy would focus on protecting the rerouted convoys that now moved around Newfoundland. The Air Force would develop new patrol patterns and new tactics suited to the expanded operational area. The acceptance of failure in one place made possible a more rational use of resources everywhere else. The men and women of the coastal communities along the St. Lawrence and the Gulf, who had lived through the summer and autumn of 1942, watching ships burn and listening to the sound of explosions, felt the closure as both relief and wound. The immediate threat was reduced because fewer ships were now moving through their waters. Yet the knowledge that this danger had forced the government to make such a massive concession was bitter. For communities that had previously felt insulated from the war, or at least able to contribute to it in clearly understood ways, the closure meant that they were no longer on the front line. The military convoys that had been organized through their harbors, the escort vessels that had been based at their docks, the activity and sense of purpose that came with being part of a major supply chain began to shift elsewhere. The economic activity that had accompanied the heavy traffic through the river in 1942 dried up quickly. The closure was necessary. The people of these communities understood that. But it did not make it any less painful, any less the feeling of having been at the center of something vast and consequential, and then, suddenly, being set aside. Throughout the winter of 1942 and into 1943, the closure remained in effect. The longer voyages continued. Ships sailed around Newfoundland in all seasons, in storms that made the transatlantic passage look calm, in seas so cold that a man fell overboard would be unconscious within minutes. The U-boats remained in the Gulf and river for some months longer, having less to hunt, but still conducting occasional operations. The Canadian Navy and Air Force, freed from the burden of trying to defend the entire St. Lawrence system, began to organize more intensive patrols of the shorter routes around Newfoundland. Aircraft that had been scattered across a dozen bases now concentrated on the areas where ships were actually sailing. Escort vessels could be organized into more coherent task forces. The shift from desperate, dispersed defense to organized, concentrated anti-submarine operations began to take shape. It was not immediate. The learning curve remained steep, but the fundamental change in the character of the battle had begun with the decision to close the river. By accepting that one piece of the war could not be won, the Canadian forces were beginning to position themselves to win other pieces more decisively. The closure of the St. Lawrence would remain in effect, with some modification, for the remainder of the war. The river would not fully reopen to ocean-going traffic until well after the submarines had ceased to be a strategic threat in Canadian waters. For 3 years after autumn 1942, the great river that had been Canada's gateway to global trade and global war would be barred to ocean vessels. Ships would still move upriver, carrying cargo, but the great ocean-going convoys that had characterized the early war years would not return. The decision that had been so painful in the making came to seem, in retrospect, like the obvious choice. But it had not felt obvious at the time. It had felt like defeat, like an admission that Canada could not win on its own terms, that the nation had to accept the constraints that geography and resources and the power of the enemy imposed upon it. That acceptance, hard as it was the beginning of wisdom. The closing of the St. Lawrence was one of the most significant defeats inflicted on the Canadian war effort by the U-boats. Not because of the ships sunk, but because it forced the nation to acknowledge the limits of its power and to reorganize itself accordingly. In that reorganization lay the seeds of the eventual Canadian triumph in the Atlantic, but that triumph would come later, earned through months of grinding effort and paid for in lives and treasure that would flow down the rerouted convoys and across the longer seas that now defined the war at Canada's doorstep. The winter of 1942 descended on Canada with particular harshness that year. In Ottawa, in the wood-panelled offices of Naval Service Headquarters and the war rooms of the Department of National Defense, there was no comfort to be found in the cold. The casualty lists from the autumn still lay on desks. The Charlottetown had gone down in the summer. The Caribou had been torn apart in October, taking hundreds of souls with her. Fishing villages along the Gulf shore had watched in horror as merchant ships burned within sight of their doorsteps, and the government's silence had only deepened the wound. Now, as 1942 turned to 1943, Canada faced a choice that would reshape the nation's entire approach to the undersea war. The catastrophe had been complete and undeniable. The response would have to be equally total. The first and most visible manifestation of this transformation was the arrival of new warships. The Royal Canadian Navy, which had grown from a peacetime force of barely a few thousand souls to something resembling a real fighting service, now received ships of actual modernity and capability. Destroyers began to arrive in Canadian ports, vessels with names that would become synonymous with this new phase of the battle. These were not the elderly, overextended corvettes that had done so much with so little. These were purposeful warships, faster, better armed, equipped with the latest detection equipment that naval science could produce. The Restigouche, the Saint Laurent, and others of their class represented a qualitative leap in Canada's naval power. They carried depth charges by the hundreds. They possessed ASDIC sonar sets of the latest pattern. They could make speeds that the older escort vessels could only dream of, speeds that would allow them to hunt submarines with genuine aggression, rather than merely shield convoys like worried shepherds. The shipyards that had built the earlier corvettes, places like the Yarrows facilities in British Columbia and the Davy yards in Quebec, now operated at near feverish capacity, producing vessels that embodied lessons learned in blood. But ships alone do not make a navy. The men who crewed them had to be trained, and trained thoroughly. This was perhaps the most crucial and least visible transformation of all. Through the winter of 1942 and into the spring of 1943, Canadian naval establishments across the country became engines of instruction and doctrine development. At Halifax, at St. Hyacinthe, at Bermuda, where escort groups practiced in deeper Atlantic waters before being assigned to the Gulf, officers and ratings learned how to use the new technologies in their possession. They studied the patterns of U-boat attack. They absorbed the hard-won tactical lessons that had come out of previous engagements. The importance of tight convoy discipline, the particular vulnerabilities of submarine captains in confined waters, the coordination required between surface vessels and air patrols. Gunnery schools taught men how to track a target in the water. ASDIC operators learned to read the mysterious pings and echoes that their equipment transmitted, to distinguish the sound of a submarine from the sound of a wreck on the bottom or a pod of whales. Men learned how to throw depth charges in patterns that would bracket a target. They learned how to read the water itself, the color, the disturbance, for signs of submarine presence. This was not hurried training. It was thorough, often grueling, carried out by instructors who understood that the next mistake might cost the lives of the men in their charge. The Royal Canadian Air Force underwent a parallel revolution. For much of 1942, the air defense of the Gulf had been hampered by a fundamental lack of long-range patrol aircraft. Flying boats, the consolidated Catalinas, the Sunderlands, were expensive and in short supply. The land-based patrols that did exist often lacked the range to cover the vast expanse of the Gulf and river in any systematic way. Now, the situation began to change. New air bases were established along the north shore of the Gulf, at places like Gaspé, at Montjoly, at Bagotville. These were not glamorous assignments. Men and women posted to these stations understood they were going to remote, cold places where the work was monotonous and the threat, though real, was often invisible. But from these bases, squadrons of Hudsons and Digbys and Catalinas now began to maintain an increasingly systematic patrol pattern. The aircraft themselves were equipped with improvements that made them far more formidable than their 1942 counterparts. Radar sets were installed in increasing numbers. Airborne searchlights, powerful lamps mounted in the fuselage, allowed crews to illuminate a U-boat on the surface at night, turning the tables on submarines that had previously enjoyed the cloak of darkness. Depth charges were fitted to aircraft racks with improved fuses. Communications between aircraft and naval vessels improved dramatically. The doctrine of close coordination, a bomber circling a detected submarine while naval vessels raced to the location, became standard practice rather than a lucky accident. The integration of air and naval forces represented perhaps the most significant institutional achievement of this period. In 1942, the Royal Canadian Navy and the Royal Canadian Air Force had often functioned as separate services, sometimes working at cross purposes, their chains of command distinct, and their doctrine unaligned. By the spring of 1943, this had changed. Commands were reorganized. Escort Group headquarters and air station commanders now operated within shared understanding of mutual support. A captain of a corvette escort would know that he could call upon air support within a matter of hours. An air station commander knew that naval vessels would respond to reports of submarine contacts. This coordination sounds simple in retrospect, but at the time it represented a genuine revolution in how the Canadian Armed Forces understood their mission. It required new bureaucracies, new communication protocols, and most crucially, a shared tactical vocabulary, a way of thinking about anti-submarine warfare that transcended the old institutional rivalries. The speed of this transformation was genuinely remarkable. In less than 6 months, from the catastrophe of the Caribou in October 1942 to the spring of 1943, the Canadian anti-submarine forces went from being reactive and desperate to being genuinely proactive and ambitious. This was not the work of any single visionary leader. Rather, it emerged from the collective learning of hundreds of officers, petty officers, and ratings who had paid for their knowledge in survivor guilt and sleepless nights. The commanding officers of the escort groups, men like Commander James Plomer and others who had endured the worst of 1942, now had the tools and the personnel to fight back. The pilots and crews of the Gulf Patrol squadrons, who had chased shadows and had often seemed to arrive too late, now had radar and searchlights and better aircraft. The sonar operators in the corvettes and destroyers had learned to read their instruments with far greater skill. Every one of these improvements was the product of someone having seen something that didn't work and having done the hard thinking to figure out how to make it better. The Canadian government also made a crucial decision regarding the organization of the naval forces themselves. The Western Local Escort Force, the ad hoc collection of vessels that had borne the brunt of the 1942 disaster, was dissolved and reorganized into something more formal and more capable. The Gulf Escort Force was established as a proper formation, with a designated commander, with assigned vessels that would work together regularly enough to develop genuine cohesion and mutual understanding. This was not merely administrative shuffling. It created institutional continuity. The same group of ships would work together repeatedly, their crews developing a deep familiarity with one another's capabilities and tendencies. It created accountability, a commander who owned the defense of the Gulf in a way that the previous fragmented system had not allowed. It created momentum, the sense among the men involved that they were part of something organized and purposeful, not just a desperate improvisation. Parallel to these formal changes came something less visible, but equally important: the development of a new Canadian naval culture around anti-submarine warfare. 1942 had been a year of humiliation for the Royal Canadian Navy. The service had been formed only in 1910 and had always existed in the shadow of the Royal Navy. Suddenly, in its own waters, it had been outmatched and outsmarted by a foreign enemy. Now, through 1943, a new confidence began to emerge. Young Canadian officers and men began to see anti-submarine warfare not as a burden imposed upon them by circumstances beyond their control, but as a distinctive professional capability that Canada could develop and master. The best and brightest of the Navy's officer corps began to concentrate on the problem. Technical innovation was encouraged. Tactical experimentation was permitted. When a particular approach to depth charge deployment seemed to work better than another, word spread through the escort groups. When an aircrew reported a new technique for searching a suspected submarine contact, it was communicated to other squadrons. This was learning at speed, learning under pressure, learning because lives depended on getting it right. The materiel situation improved not just through new arrivals, but through the modification of existing vessels. The older corvettes that had borne such a terrible burden in 1942 were systematically upgraded. Their ASDIC equipment was improved. Their depth charge capacity was increased. Their weaponry was modified to be more effective. Some of the older vessels, like those of the Bangor-class minesweepers, were retrofitted for anti-submarine duties. These ships had never been designed for the work they were now being asked to do, but desperate circumstances and Canadian ingenuity combined to make them useful. Men who worked in the dockyards along the St. Lawrence and in Halifax labored with a particular urgency. They understood, even if they never directly witnessed the undersea carnage, that the ships they were modifying would return to the Gulf. The men who crewed those ships were their neighbors, their families. The work took on the character of something more than mere wartime production. It became a kind of communal effort at restitution. The question of long-range aircraft remained vexing through much of this period. The Royal Canadian Air Force simply did not have enough patrol aircraft to provide continuous cover over the entire Gulf. The consolidated Catalinas, that were considered the ideal aircraft for the role, were expensive and in short supply, in demand everywhere in the Allied air forces. What Canada received was a mixture of types, each with its own strengths and limitations. The Hudsons were faster but had shorter range. The Digby's were a Canadian-built variant of the Lockheed family of aircraft, more numerous but less capable than the larger flying boats. The Sunderlands, when available, were magnificent machines, but desperately scarce. Commanders had to work with what they had, developing patrol patterns that squeezed maximum effectiveness from limited resources. This was planning at the edge of capability, but it worked. By the spring of 1943, the Gulf was being patrolled on a schedule that meant a U-boat might encounter an aircraft at almost any time of day, in almost any weather that allowed flying. The psychological pressure on submarine crews of this constant surveillance cannot be overstated. The establishment of new shore facilities extended beyond air bases. Radar stations were erected along the coast of the Gulf, at Gaspé, and other strategic points. These were crude by later standards, but they represented a technological revolution for the defenders. For the first time, Canadian forces could detect a U-boat on the surface, at night or in fog, conditions that had previously favored the attacker completely. Signal Corps personnel trained to operate this equipment. Radio operators learned new procedures for communicating detected contacts. The entire apparatus of detection, communication, and response began to function with a coordination that had barely existed in 1942. A merchant convoy moving through the Gulf now had layers of protection that had been unimaginable just months before. Long-range aircraft could be called upon. Radar might have detected a lurking U-boat. Escorts equipped with the latest ASDIC were ready to respond. This was not impenetrable defense. No defense ever is. But it represented a fundamental shift in the balance. By the spring of 1943, the transformation was largely complete. The Canadian forces that had been stumbling in darkness and confusion in the autumn of 1942 had become, by the standards of anti-submarine warfare at that time, a genuinely formidable opponent. The U-boat crews returning to Canadian waters in the summer of 1943 would find an entirely different tactical environment. They would encounter aircraft fitted with radar. They would face escort vessels equipped with the latest detection equipment and crewed by men who had learned, through bitter experience, how to use it effectively. They would operate in waters that were being systematically patrolled by forces that had learned to coordinate air and naval operations in a way that made the combined defense far more dangerous than any individual component. The road from catastrophe to capability had been compressed into just 6 months. That compression was the result of choices made in Ottawa, of priorities established and resources allocated, but more fundamentally, it was the result of learning. Every ship sunk in 1942 had been a lesson written in blood. Now, in 1943, those lessons would be implemented in steel and flesh, in new tactics and better equipment, in trained crews ready to fight back. In the spring of 1943, Admiral Karl Dönitz faced a choice that would define the final phase of the U-boat war in Canadian waters. The Battle of the Atlantic, that vast and grinding struggle between the submarines and the Allied convoys, had turned decisively against Germany in May. The wolf packs that had ravaged shipping lanes across the North Atlantic began to take catastrophic losses. U-boats were being sunk faster than German shipyards could replace them, and the technological advantage that the submarines had enjoyed was slipping away. Radar, that revolutionary detection device, had become standard equipment on Allied escort vessels and long-range patrol aircraft. The Allies were reading German radio traffic with increasing accuracy. The U-boat arm, which had promised to starve Britain into submission, was facing its own slow strangulation. Yet Dönitz, the austere, calculating architect of the submarine campaign, refused to accept that the war beneath the waves was lost. He would simply fight it in a different place. He would send his boats back to the Gulf of St. Lawrence, back to the waters where the previous summer they had tasted success, back to waters where the Canadians, he believed, were still vulnerable and unprepared. The logic was not entirely irrational, though it was increasingly desperate. Germany's submarines were suffering appalling losses in the open Atlantic. In May of 1943 alone, 41 U-boats were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The Wolfpack tactics that had been developed with such care and lethal precision were now suicidal against an enemy that could detect them miles away through fog and darkness, could call down aircraft within hours, could position escort vessels with intelligence gathered from decoded radio signals. The Atlantic had become a graveyard where submarines went to die. But the Gulf of St. Lawrence remained, from Berlin's perspective, a backwater, a distant, confined, awkwardly defended body of water where a few submarines might still inflict damage on a Canadian navy that had been badly shocked by the previous year's campaign. The very fact that the St. Lawrence had been closed to ocean-going convoy traffic seemed proof that the Canadians could be pushed around. If a few U-boats could tie down Canadian resources, disrupt their coastal shipping, and remind North America that the war had come to their own shores, the strategic value might justify the risk. Dönitz ordered the boats prepared. The summer of 1943 would see German submarines return to Canadian waters. But the Germany that sent these submarines north was not the Germany that had launched the first offensive against the St. Lawrence a year before. The U-boat crews themselves were often younger, less experienced, hastily trained to replace the cadres of skilled submariners that had been lost in the Atlantic. The boats themselves were the standard Type 7 design, smaller, shorter-legged, and less comfortable than the Type 9 vessels that had dominated the previous campaign, and far more vulnerable to the modern escort vessels and aircraft they would encounter. More critically, the Canadian defences had been transformed. The Royal Canadian Navy was no longer the improvised, under-equipped service that had faced the first U-boat offensive in a state of shock and disbelief. Corvettes that had been patched together from pre-war designs were being replaced by modern, purpose-built anti-submarine vessels. The Royal Canadian Air Force had equipped its coastal patrol squadrons with long-range Liberator bombers, carrying radar sets and powerful searchlights, aircraft that could hunt submarines night and day, in conditions where the underwater vessel could no longer rely on darkness for concealment. Canadian commanders understood the threat in a way they had not understood it before. The censorship had been lifted on the worst of the St. Lawrence sinkings, and the Canadian public and military alike were grimly aware that the submarines had once operated in these waters with virtual impunity. That humiliation would not be repeated. The Canadian forces were ready to fight. The first renewed attacks came in the latter part of May 1943, when German U-boats began appearing in the Gulf once more. On the 24th of May, the submarine U-boat 301 attacked a convoy of small vessels and fishing craft off Matane on the southern shore of the St. Lawrence, sinking the British cargo vessel HMS Athabascan and damaging several others. The attack itself was a shock. For many along the river, the previous year's campaign had begun to fade into the realm of nightmare, something that happened in 1942, but surely could not happen again. The appearance of fresh U-boat activity meant that the nightmare was recurring. Over the following weeks, merchant vessels were sunk in the Gulf and the lower St. Lawrence with grim regularity. In early June, the U-boat 511 attacked a small convoy of ships under Canadian escort, sinking the British freighter Nera and the Canadian fishing vessel Lucille M. The losses accumulated slowly, but remorsefully, each sinking a fresh reminder that the submarines had returned and that the Canadian defences, however improved, were not yet sufficient to prevent them. But the difference between this second campaign and the first would become apparent in the response that the submarines would now face. The Canadian forces moved with a decisiveness and confidence that had been absent in 1942. When U-boat attacks were reported, aircraft were in the air within hours, not days. Escorts were vectored to the scene of attacks by radio direction finding stations that could locate the submarines' transmissions. The Gulf Coast had been ringed with new radar stations and lookout posts. Canadian commanders, now blooded by a year of hard experience, understood how to hunt submarines in confined waters, understood the tactics that worked, understood how to coordinate surface vessels and aircraft in a unified hunt. The first major clash of the renewed campaign came on the 29th of June, when the minesweeper HMCS Shawinigan, a small wooden-hulled Canadian warship, encountered U-boat 269 in the St. Lawrence River itself, and attacked immediately with depth charges. The U-boat, damaged and unable to operate, was forced to surface, and the Shawinigan opened fire with its guns in a desperate action at close quarters. The submarine was sunk, one of only a handful of U-boats destroyed by ramming or gunfire in the entire Second World War, and the first clear indication that the balance of power had shifted. German submarines no longer hunted the Canadian waters with immunity. Over the subsequent weeks and months, the pattern became increasingly clear to German command. The submarines were being detected with regularity that suggested Canadian acquisition of new and more sophisticated detection equipment. Aircraft appeared overhead with a speed that indicated coordinated air-sea operations of a kind that had previously been lacking. When submarines were attacked, they faced methodical, sustained assaults using modern tactics rather than the chaotic, almost desperate counterattacks of the previous year. On the 19th of July, the corvette HMCS Gull attacked U-boat 264 with a series of depth charge patterns that damaged the submarine severely enough to force it to the surface, where it was destroyed by gunfire and ramming. In August, the U-boat 203 was located and attacked by Canadian aircraft and escorts, sunk with significant loss of life among the crew. Another vessel, the U-boat 511, which had successfully attacked merchant shipping in the Gulf, was tracked and attacked by the minesweeper Shawinigan and sunk in a surface action. The casualty list for German submarines was growing, and growing rapidly. Dönitz received reports from his field commanders indicating that the situation in Canadian waters had become untenable. The submarines were facing a coordinated, modern defense that had not existed the previous year. The technological advantages that the U-boats had enjoyed in 1942, superior knowledge of coastal waters, the element of surprise, the inability of Canadian forces to detect them reliably, had all been negated. The human cost of these losses was immense and invisible to the Canadian public, hidden still behind official silence and the nature of submarine warfare itself, which tends to produce losses so complete and so far from public view that they can be denied or forgotten for generations. But within the German Navy and among the U-boat flotillas, the return to Canadian waters had taken on a poisonous reputation. The boats that had been selected for this second campaign were crewed by younger men who now understood that they were being sent on extremely dangerous missions with little chance of success and a high probability of death. Some of the crews had been rotated back from the Atlantic, where at least the odds of survival were statistically better. The Quebec Flotilla, as the German Navy called the Canadian operation, was becoming a career-ending posting. Word filtered back to the flotilla bases in occupied France that the Canadians had become dangerous, that their defenses were unexpectedly formidable, that losses were unsustainable. The U-boat command faced a decision point identical to the one that had confronted the Canadians a year earlier. At what point did the losses outweigh any possible strategic benefit? Yet Dönitz did not immediately order a withdrawal. The submarines continued to be sent back to the Gulf and river through the latter months of 1943, as if German command was unable to admit that the operation had failed, or was hoping that some miracle of tactics or luck might reverse the deteriorating situation. On the 18th of November, U-boat 206 was sunk off Anticosti Island with all hands. U-boat 516, which had sunk merchant shipping in the St. Lawrence earlier in the season, was attacked and damaged by Canadian aircraft and forced to withdraw from Canadian waters, limping back across the Atlantic, bearing the marks of wounds that would require weeks of repair. The casualties accumulated, not in great dramatic battles, but in the grinding, methodical elimination of individual submarines. The Canadian forces had learned their trade well. They understood now how to exploit their advantage in detection equipment, how to coordinate aircraft and surface vessels in concentrated attacks, how to pursue submarines relentlessly through the confined waters where escape was far more difficult than in the open ocean. The balance had shifted, not just tactically, but psychologically. The hunters had become the hunted. Where the previous summer, the submarines had inspired terror and confusion among merchant sailors and escort crews, now it was the German submariners who faced the terror of the counterattack, the agony of knowing that they had been detected and that death was close. The U-boats that had once prowled the St. Lawrence with near immunity were now the prey. As the summer turned to autumn in 1943, German command began to face the unwelcome reality that the Canadian waters operation had failed. The submarines were being sunk or damaged at rates that could not be sustained. The Canadian Navy and Air Force, far from being the secondary threat that had been envisioned in Berlin, had proven themselves capable modern, and increasingly formidable opponents. The strategic objective of the second campaign, to disrupt Canadian shipping, tie down Canadian resources, and remind North America that the war had not been won, had been achieved only minimally. Meanwhile, the cost in submarines and crew lives was growing month by month. Dönitz, his instinct for offense at war, with his recognition of strategic reality, gradually began to scale back the operation. The submarines that had been designated for the St. Lawrence were reassigned to other theaters. By late autumn, only occasional U-boats were attempting to penetrate Canadian waters, and even those were operating under orders to avoid contact and withdraw as soon as they were detected. The second U-boat offensive in the Gulf of St. Lawrence was winding down, not with a climactic battle or a dramatic German withdrawal, but with the slow, grinding recognition that the campaign had become unwinnable. What the summer and autumn of 1943 demonstrated, far more clearly than the chaos of 1942, was the Canadian transformation from victim to victor. A year of losses had been processed into institutional knowledge. The shock of the first campaign had been replaced by steady competence. The Canadian Navy and Air Force had stopped being the hunted and had become the hunters. This was not a sudden transformation, but the cumulative result of 1,000 small decisions. Better training, better equipment, better coordination, better tactics. Sailors and aircrew who had been nearly helpless in 1942 were now striking back with accuracy and effect. The fact that this achievement has been largely forgotten in the wider historical account of the Second World War does not diminish its significance. The summer of 1943 marked the true turning point in the Battle of the St. Lawrence. From this point forward, the U-boats that ventured into Canadian waters did so with the knowledge that they were likely to be hunted down and destroyed. The river had been closed to the submarines, not by decree or strategic decision from on high, but by the competent application of naval and air power, by forces that had learned their trade through blood and loss. The Germans would attempt to continue operations in Canadian waters through 1944 and into 1945, but they would do so with minimal effect and at mounting cost. The war in the St. Lawrence was entering its final, grinding phase, a war that Germany was losing, slowly and inexorably, in waters that had already cost them dearly and would cost them more. For nearly 18 months, the men of the Royal Canadian Navy and Royal Canadian Air Force had endured a grinding humiliation. Ships burned on a river that had been promised safe. Submarines ghosted through waters Canadian officers insisted they could protect. Corvettes searched desperately in the dark and found nothing. Patrol aircraft flew hundreds of hours and saw only empty water and cold sky. The summer of 1943 arrived with something new, a weapon and a will. By autumn, everything had changed. The hunters became the hunted, and for the first time in the battle for the St. Lawrence, Canadian forces seized the initiative and held it. The turning point had come, not because of some revolutionary new technology or strategic masterstroke, but because Canadian sailors and airmen had been forged in the fire of repeated failure and had learned their trade with the desperation of men fighting for their home waters. The transformation began quietly, almost unremarked. Through the spring of 1943, the Canadian Naval Service had undertaken a complete overhaul of its anti-submarine doctrine and equipment. The Fairmile launches, those small wooden motorboats that had been pressed into service as escorts, were being supplemented by more corvettes, newly fitted with improved ASDIC sonar that was beginning to give reliable readings, even in the turbulent Gulf waters. The Royal Canadian Air Force had established new patrol squadrons, equipped with twin-engine Canso aircraft, the North American variant of the British Catalina, that could remain aloft for 14 hours or more and carry bombs and depth charges. Most crucially, these aircraft were being fitted with radar. The radar equipment was not sophisticated by later standards, but in the waters of the St. Lawrence it proved revolutionary. A U-boat on the surface at night, running on diesel engines to charge its batteries before diving at dawn, had no way to detect the radar pulses sweeping across the Gulf. The aircraft could see it before the submarine knew it was no longer alone in the darkness. The Canadian crews themselves had been transformed by loss and bitter experience. The corvette captains, who had spent the summer of 1942 firing blindly at sonar contacts or searching empty seas for hours, had been replaced by men who had faced real combat. The aircraft captains had learned to trust their instincts about where the submarines would be, to read the weather and the water conditions and the patterns of merchant shipping with an almost uncanny accuracy. The escort sailors, who had pulled survivors from the water and carried the weight of failure ashore, now understood viscerally what it meant to let a submarine escape. They trained with new equipment, yes, but more importantly, they trained with purpose. Every depth charge was thrown with the memory of a ship going down. Every radar contact investigated with the knowledge that here, at last, was a chance for revenge. The psychological transformation was as important as the material one. The first clear success came on the 6th of August, 1943, when a Canso aircraft of the Royal Canadian Air Force, flying from Chatham Airfield in New Brunswick, made radar contact with a U-boat in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The aircraft dove toward the target in darkness, guided by the radar blip on the screen, and released depth charges across the submarine's position. The crew heard the explosions even as they climbed away. They circled and searched the water, but saw nothing in the darkness. For hours, they did not know if the attack had caused any damage. Over the following weeks, German naval records would confirm what Canadian signals intelligence would gradually discover, that this attack had indeed damaged a U-boat. The boat had limped back across the Atlantic, barely making it home. It was a small victory, almost negligible in the grand scope of the war, but it mattered profoundly to the men involved. For the first time since the battle began, a Canadian attack on a U-boat appeared to have borne fruit. More successes followed through the late summer and into the autumn. On the 9th of September, a corvette named HMCS Shawinigan made sonar contact with a submarine near the mouth of the St. Lawrence River and attacked with depth charges. The U-boat, damaged by the attack, was forced to remain on the surface, and the corvette's crew could see it in the dim light before dawn. They attacked again, and the U-boat commander, understanding that he had run out of room to maneuver, made the decision to scuttle his vessel rather than allow it to be captured or sunk by ramming. The crew abandoned ship in the cold water of the St. Lawrence, and they were picked up by the Canadian escorts. For the men of HMCS Shawinigan, it was an extraordinary moment. They had not merely attacked a submarine, they had destroyed it. They had taken prisoners. They had made tangible their skill and their courage. The story filtered through the naval service and gave hope to every escort crew operating in the Gulf. The expanding Canadian air operations began to yield results with increasing regularity. Radar-equipped Canso aircraft were now flying patrol lines across the Gulf on virtually every night when weather permitted. The pilots and air crews developed a tactically sophisticated understanding of how to hunt the U-boats. They understood that the submarines had to surface at night to run on diesel engines and charge their batteries, creating a narrow window of vulnerability. They understood the water conditions and weather patterns that would drive U-boats toward the surface or keep them submerged. They understood how to approach an unsuspecting submarine without being detected, using darkness and the noise of their own engines to mask their approach until the moment of attack. They were becoming hunters in truth, not merely searchers hoping for blind luck. The Luftwaffe had no presence in the area, German air power was being consumed in the vast struggles over Europe and the Mediterranean, so Canadian aircraft operated with near-complete freedom. A U-boat captain in the St. Lawrence no longer enjoyed the advantage of seeing his enemy first. That terrible advantage had shifted. The U-boat losses began to accumulate. In September of 1943, a submarine was damaged and forced to return across the Atlantic. In October, another boat was attacked and sunk. In November, yet another was heavily damaged. Each loss was a shock to the German submarine command. For 2 years, the St. Lawrence had been a hunting ground, where German submarines operated with little to fear. The Canadian escorts were weak, the air patrols were sparse and poorly equipped, and the U-boats held every tactical advantage. Now, suddenly, men who had grown accustomed to operating in relative safety found themselves in genuine danger. Captains who had sunk merchant ships nearly at will now reported terrifying encounters with aircraft that appeared out of darkness with no warning. They reported depth charges exploding around them with lethal accuracy. They reported sonar contacts that turned into coordinated attacks by both air and surface forces. The psychological reversal was as abrupt as it was complete. The waters that had seemed like a predator's paradise had become a trap. The confidence of Canadian crews began to visibly change as September turned to October and autumn settled over the Gulf. The officers who had commanded corvettes and launches through the humiliation of 1942 and the frustration of early 1943 began to carry themselves differently. They had tasted success. They had drawn blood. They had proven themselves capable of defeating the enemy in a fair fight, and in several cases, they had proven themselves capable of victory, even when facing an enemy that had previously held every advantage. The sonar operators began to trust their equipment and their instincts with new confidence. When a contact was made, it was investigated with the knowledge that the enemy might actually be found there, might actually be attacked, might actually be destroyed. The depth charge crews developed a grim proficiency in loading and arming their weapons. Every man aboard every escort vessel understood that the impossible had begun to happen. The hunters were becoming the hunted. By the late autumn of 1943, a qualitative shift had become visible to any commander observing the operations in the Gulf. The U-boats were reporting attacks with increasing frequency. Some boats were choosing to avoid the St. Lawrence entirely and operate in the broader Gulf, or even attempt the passage around Newfoundland, rather than risk the inner waters, where Canadian air power and naval forces operated with growing efficiency. The German naval staff, reviewing reports from commanders in the field, began to recognize that the golden period of easy hunting was over. New submarines continued to be sent to Canadian waters through the remainder of 1943 and into 1944, but the strategic rationale for doing so had shifted. The boats were no longer expected to inflict crippling losses on merchant shipping or to terrify the Canadian coast into submission. Instead, they were being sent to tie down Canadian naval and air resources, to force the Canadians to maintain costly patrol operations in the Gulf, and to extract whatever toll they could in the knowledge that the broader Battle of the Atlantic was being lost. The turning point of the Battle of the St. Lawrence was not marked by any single dramatic engagement or by the sinking of a particularly famous U-boat. Instead, it was marked by the accumulation of success after success by Canadian forces that had learned, through hard experience and persistent effort, how to defeat an enemy that had once seemed nearly invincible in these waters. The corvette captains and the aircraft pilots and the sonar operators and the depth charge crews had taken the humiliation of 1942 and transformed it into a forge in which new capabilities and new confidence were being created. By the autumn of 1943, every U-boat commander entering the St. Lawrence knew that he was entering waters that no longer belonged to him, where the enemy had learned to hunt as effectively as he had learned to kill, where the days of easy victory were finished, and the days of terrible risk had begun. The hunters had become the hunted, and this reversal, more than any other single factor, ensured that the U-boat's presence in Canadian waters, while remaining dangerous and damaging until the very end of the war, would never again pose the strategic threat that they had posed in those awful months when Canada had discovered that the war had come home. The numbers told the story in ledgers and official lists. More than 23 merchant ships lost in the St. Lawrence and Gulf. More than 2,000 men and women killed. But numbers, however precise, cannot hold the weight of what it meant to die in waters that were supposed to be safe, or to survive that dying and carry it forward into a life that resumed without warning. This chapter belongs to them, to the merchant sailors who heard the torpedo strike and felt the ship shudder around them, to the men who clung to wreckage in water cold enough to kill within minutes, to the townspeople who smelled burning fuel oil on the wind and understood that the war had come to their doorstep. The Battle of the St. Lawrence was fought in darkness and in silence, but it left scars that light could not erase. When a ship went down in the St. Lawrence, the dying did not happen in some distant, abstract theatre. It happened in sight of land. The crews and passengers of vessels sunk in the river and Gulf died with Canadian soil visible on the horizon, with lighthouse beams cutting across the night, with fishing boats and ferry captains watching the end come. This terrible proximity changed the nature of the suffering. A man drowning in the mid-Atlantic might go unwitnessed, his death absorbed into the vastness of the ocean. But a man drowning in the St. Lawrence had neighbors. The crews of the merchant vessels that sailed these waters came from everywhere: Britain, Poland, Norway, Greece, China, the United States. They were professional seamen and frightened young men. Many had already survived other sinkings, other torpedoes. They knew the chances were against them, and they sailed anyway, because the ships had to move and the convoys had to form. When the U-boats came, these men faced the same equation that had killed their comrades in the Atlantic. Seconds to abandon ship, minutes to survive, in water that drained the heat from the human body, in stages that felt like hours. The sinking of the SS Charlottetown stands as one chronicle, but it was far from alone. The cargo vessel Glenroy went down carrying supplies and 10 men of her crew. The British freighter Oakton sank with losses among her merchant sailors. The Anastasia, the Abba, the Travessa, names that appear in shipping registers and in the careful archives maintained by maritime historians. Names that appeared in no censored newspapers of 1942. Each represented a different collection of human beings. The Glenroy carried men who had families waiting for letters that would never arrive. The Oakton had crew members from nations occupied by Nazi Germany, men fighting the only way available to them by sailing ships that mattered to the war effort. When the Caribou went down in October of 1942, it killed more than 130 people in a single hour. An explosion of loss so large that even the censorship regime could not contain it. The ship had been a ferry in peacetime, carrying civilians and troops together in the way that civilian vessels did when they were needed for war. The darkness and cold had no regard for such distinctions. The survivors carried stories that the censorship regime could not fully suppress, though it tried. A man pulled from the water by a rescue vessel arrived in a coastal town with burns on his skin and trauma written into the way he breathed. He could not be prevented from speaking to his family, to neighbors, to the people he encountered as he recovered or as he did not recover. Word spread in fishing villages that lay outside the formal information channels of the censored press. Rumors traveled across kitchen tables and in the letters that soldiers and sailors sent home before those letters were read by military censors. The women and children of coastal communities learned the truth through the presence of survivors, through the oil slicks that appeared offshore, through the wreckage that washed ashore and had to be accounted for. They learned it through the simple fact of absence. Ships that did not return, captains and crew members who did not come home, the faces that did not appear on the dock anymore. The silence of the official record could not silence the silence of empty chairs at dinner tables. The merchant sailors who died in these waters represented a particular kind of courage, one that tends to be overlooked in the grand narratives of military history. They were not soldiers following orders written into the protocols of military command. They were civilian workers, many of whom could have pursued safer employment, but who continued to sail because the convoy system depended on them and because the supplies mattered. Every ship that went down took with it food destined for Britain, ammunition for the military, fuel for aircraft. The merchant marine was the arterial system of the war effort, and the men who worked in it knew that they were targets. Some kept diaries, some wrote letters home that survived the censors. These documents reveal a complex psychology, the gallows humor that men develop in the face of statistical likelihood of death, the homesickness that intensifies when you know you may not go home again, the strange comradeship that forms among crews who understand they are facing the same thin odds. When a ship sank, the survivors who made it to lifeboats or to rescue vessels carried these stories into the world, carrying them for decades in some cases, until the censorship ended and they could finally speak openly about what they had witnessed. The U-boat crews, by contrast, faced their own catastrophe with different circumstances but comparable intensity. A submarine is a coffin with an engine, and every man who served aboard one knew this. The U-boats operating in the St. Lawrence were far from the advanced bases where damaged boats could be quickly repaired. They operated in confined waters where a single error, a miscalculation of depth, a moment of inattention on the part of a lookout could mean the loss of the entire boat and all hands. The acoustic properties of the St. Lawrence were unfamiliar to crews trained in the open Atlantic. The freshwater influence from the river's discharge into the Gulf created thermal layers that played tricks on sonar and made navigation a constant process of relearning. U-boat crews spoke in their logs and in post-war accounts of the claustrophobia of these waters, the knowledge that they were operating in a region where the enemy was growing more capable every week, and where a return journey that should have been straightforward might be cut short by depth charges and ramming attacks. The men aboard the submarines that were sunk, and several were lost in Canadian waters, died in the knowledge that they were trapped beneath hundreds of meters of water, that the pressure was building around the hull, that there was no escape. That kind of death has a particular horror to it, one that haunted the survivors of the submarine war for the rest of their lives. The Canadian corvette crews experienced their own form of this trauma. These were young men, many of them drawn from the civilian population and given minimal training before being sent to sea. A corvette was a small, exposed platform from which to wage war against an enemy you could not see. The men who served in these vessels, the sailors who maintained the engines, the deck crews who stood watch in the Atlantic weather, the officers who made the decisions that meant life or death, carried psychological wounds that were rarely acknowledged in the context of 1942 and 1943. Shell shock, as it was still called, was something that happened in trenches. The idea that a naval seaman might require psychological support for the trauma of sitting in the middle of the Atlantic, listening for submarines, knowing that your ship could be hit at any moment and sank faster than you could prepare. This understanding came much later, if at all. The losses among Canadian naval personnel were not as catastrophic as those suffered by the merchant marine, but they were grievous. The men aboard the Charlottetown knew what it meant to be sunk by an enemy weapon. The survivors had to live with that knowledge, and they had to understand that their comrades had died while performing their duty to defend their own country. The communities along the St. Lawrence and Gulf Coast lived through the battle in a way that no other Canadian communities did during the war. They had no shelter, no evacuation plans, no sense that they were being protected. A merchant vessel sank offshore and the bodies washed ashore. A U-boat attack occurred at night, and the survivors crawled onto the beach, soaked and shocked. The people of towns like Matan, Rimouski, Les Escoumins, and others along the river witnessed the immediate, tangible evidence of the war. They watched ships burn. They helped rescue survivors. They buried the dead who came ashore. They lived with the knowledge that the enemy was present, visible, immediate. For a Canadian community in 1942, this was not a theoretical understanding of war. It was visceral, present, impossible to ignore. The elderly residents of these towns, interviewed decades later when the censorship regime had ended and historians finally began asking them about their experience, spoke of the shock of seeing a burning ship, of the smell of fuel oil, of the sound of explosions across the water at night. These memories shaped how an entire generation understood the Second World War and their place in it. The fishermen and harbor pilots who worked the waters of the St. Lawrence carried their own burden. They knew these waters intimately, and they knew when something was wrong. They could read the signs of wreckage, could interpret the presence of oil slicks and floating debris. Some of them participated in rescue operations, pulling survivors from the water, bringing them ashore in small boats, knowing that they might themselves become targets for the same enemy they were working against. The stories of these men, many of them never formally recorded, preserved only in family memory and local lore, reveal a kind of heroism that operates outside the formal structures of military command. They acted because people needed help, because a ship had gone down near their home, because the work of rescue was the work of their community. The censorship that prevented newspapers from reporting what had happened could not prevent these men from knowing. They lived the reality of the battle. Every day they went to work. The lasting psychological impact of the Battle of the St. Lawrence on the Canadian population operated in two registers simultaneously. There was, first, the immediate impact on the people who lived through it in real time. The trauma of those years when the war was present, immediate, and inarguable. And then there was the delayed impact, the strange sense of historical erasure that came when the war ended and the censorship files remained closed for decades. And Canadians learned, if they learned at all, that something significant had happened in their own waters that had been kept from them. The loss of a country's ability to see its own history unfold creates a particular kind of wound. It tells the citizens that they are not trusted with the truth. It tells them that official power has the right to determine not just what they do, but what they remember, what they know, what they can claim as part of their own experience. When the censorship finally ended and the accounts of the St. Lawrence campaign began to emerge in the 1970s and 80s, many Canadians encountered their own history as if for the first time. The merchant sailors and U-boat crews who died in the St. Lawrence were absorbed into broader statistics. Their names appear in the rolls of the lost, in shipping registers, in the careful genealogical records maintained by researchers and descendants. But the experience of their dying, the moment of impact when the torpedo hit and the ship began to sink, the realization that this was not a theoretical danger, but an actual, immediate reality, This cannot be fully captured in a documentary or archived in a database. It exists in the silence that follows a sinking, in the voices of survivors recorded decades later, speaking about men they knew and lost, in the unread letters written by men before they died, in the photographs of young faces in uniform that were kept by families who never learned the full circumstances of their deaths. The human cost of the Battle of the St. Lawrence was measured not just in bodies, but in the profound, lasting disruption of lives of survivors who had to learn to function after witnessing horrors that they could barely articulate, lives of families who had to absorb the loss of men who had been at the center of their world, lives of communities that had to incorporate into their sense of self the knowledge that the war had come to their doorstep and killed people they knew. The river remembers in ways that official history often does not. The ships rest on the bottom of the Gulf, their holds still full of cargo in some cases, their decks the habitat of creatures that dwell at depth. The men who died aboard them are part of the river now, their bodies and the energy they contained dispersed into the cold water. The communities along the coast have, in recent decades, begun the work of remembering officially, erecting memorials and plaques that name the ships and sometimes the individuals who died. This work of public remembrance represents a kind of healing, a restoration of the balance between what happened and what is acknowledged to have happened. The families of the lost have had to wait a very long time for this acknowledgement. Some did not live to see it, but the act of naming, of saying aloud that this ship sank, that these people died, that it mattered and still matters, carries a power that numbers and statistics cannot hold. In the end, the human cost of the Battle of the St. Lawrence cannot be separated from the human cost of the censorship that followed it, the silence that treated the suffering of the dead and the witnesses as something that could be erased from official memory. By the winter of 1943, the U-boat war in the St. Lawrence had reached its inflection point. The German submarines that had prowled Canadian waters with near impunity 12 months earlier now faced enemies with teeth. Canadian escort vessels no longer hunted in the darkness alone. Radar sets mounted on corvettes